All right, we are live, MythVision podcast, addressing the critics. Yes, Inspiring Philosophy, Michael Jones and David Wood did an episode recently, and on that episode, my name got brought up. And of course, it got brought up with some things that obviously I don't draw the conclusion on. And some things I would say, yeah, I think you're missing the boat. I don't think you're seeing what we're seeing. So I have Derreck Bennett joining us today. I have Camille Gregor joining us today, and they're going to take over. Have a nice day, guys.
Hi. How's it going?
What's going on, gentlemen? I want to give first out the gate. If you don't know who these gentlemen are, go check out their YouTube channel. I pinned Derreck's up at the top. Initially, we were just going to have Derreck come on, and I'm like, well, why not? Camille's been diving deep into this subject as well. And we're going to do some comparing Jesus and other figures and things like that. And how should we assess this information? Is Christianity protected by, is Jesus Bubble Boy? If you've ever seen the movie Bubble Boy, like he lives in a bubble, and if he goes outside that bubble, he dies, right? Like his mama told him, like, hey, your whole life, you need to live in this bubble. It protects you from the diseases and germs and all that stuff in the outer world. But if you come outside that bubble, you're going to die. Now, I personally believed that about Jesus. And if Jesus was too far outside of that bubble, Christianity died for me. And for some Christians, I don't understand it, but hey, it's your decision, it's your choice, it's your faith. They find a way to reconcile their faith, and they still recognize categories and other figures who die and ascend and descend to the underworld and rise again and walk on water or whatever they might do. Buddha did that. You kind of find a way to say, well, this one's special, and I believe in this one. Go subscribe to Derreck Bennett. Make sure you do that. And Cam, the YouTube link, I'm about to post that in the chat. How are you gentlemen doing?
I'm having a really good hair day, as you can tell. So that's got me, I'm uplifted. That's all I need. That's my juice.
Yeah, I've been taking care of my kids the whole day, so I'm absolutely exhausted. I'll see how well this goes.
Well, I hope it goes well, and bear with Derreck's demonic internet. For some reason, it keeps kicking him off. I don't know. It just happens. We're going to try and get that fixed as time goes by, but also consider joining the Patreon. I let everybody know who supports me there that we're going to be doing this today. And I hope that both David Wood and Inspiring Philosophy, Michael Jones, will check this out, give us their thoughts. And I tagged them on Twitter and, of course, tagged them on Facebook. I'd love to have an ensuing conversation at some point to discuss our differences and why we disagree and why we agree as a friendly discussion, so people can understand where each side is coming from. All right. Appreciate the plugs and letting me plug. Today, Derreck, I'm going to let you kind of lead us off and let me know when I need to play the clip, if I need to start that out the gate to get people wet, their appetite wet here.
Get them wet. I think we should probably frame the conversation. Like, what is it that we are responding to? What is the context and stuff like that?
So the context is, this is David Wood and Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy. They're actually responding to Bill Maher. So this is stuff that Bill Maher said in conversation with Mike Tyson. And Bill Maher is, just as he shared in his film Religulous, he's sharing these parallels with Mike Tyson that come from Zeitgeist. So Michael Jones and David Wood are having a field day with this. They're calling out Bill Maher on his ignorance concerning comparative religion, where he's still pushing the whole zeitgeist thing. And they're right to do so. I mean, almost 90% of what David Wood and Michael Jones are saying in this video, I agree with. They're absolutely correct to call out bad scholarship or pseudo scholarship. Look, don't get me wrong. I like Bill Maher. I enjoy him as a political comedian. But when he's discussing religion, he doesn't really know what he's talking about in terms of comparative religion. So they're just blasting him. And Yeah, they're mostly on point, but there does come a point where Michael Jones steers it a little bit more into my wheelhouse when discussing the more scholarly stuff, and that's the stuff that I wanted to respond to because, like I said, it's right in my wheelhouse.
And we're going to get to that. My name got brought up, or MythVision's name was brought up right after, like, obviously things that we would agree with Michael and David on that are just overstretch, overkill, we don't find in the sources, things like that. I want to give a shout out, of course, to super chats along the way. If there are questions, I'll try and wait till there's like a window, and Derek and Camille, I'll of course bring, hey, is this a good time we can address these questions? Just a shout out to Critical Faculty saying, warming up the party, love me some Derricks in my life, call me a D-head. We are Wet Vision and Moist Vision in the house. So we're all wet today. Also, Dr. Josh and the Hizzy, who is MythVision Podcast, and why should anyone listen to him? Silly atheist. You know, he's a presuppositionalist. I don't even know how to begin with him. So,
Dr. Josh, that's not nice.
It's not.
Those are unkind words, sir.
Yeah, it is. I'm going to go ahead and start it off, and you're going to stop me. I'll say stuff. You'll say stuff as we agree and disagree along the way with what's being said. But the fact that my name was mentioned is the reason this response is done. And the reason I feel I don't need to do this, me and Camille talked about this yesterday. He's like, dude, you really don't have to respond at all. And you're right. I don't. I have legit scholars that are out here that are actually doing this stuff, and people who are actually listening to the scholars, checking out sources and stuff can make up their own mind. But when you have YouTube people, right, that are just laymen out there listening to stuff, especially when there's the herd mentality, and they kind of have like, maybe I'll say something. I'm going to use myself to critique myself. I might say something and my audience members might believe what I say because I have influence. I'm an influencer on them. And so they take to the bank, Derek said this, I agree with Derek, but maybe I'm wrong. And so if I'm wrong, I want people to be more critical and examine the sources themselves and make up their own minds. Like I think a lot of my audience does. Like there are plenty of people who are mythicists in my audience. There are plenty of people who are historicists. There are people, you name it. There are people all over the place. And some may have been influenced by what I've done, but I've tried to filter it through scholarship so that people understand my conclusions. And then some of them go, I just don't follow Derek on that conclusion. Fine, that's your mind. But there are a lot of Christians who I saw in the comment section in this video who are really just melting by what is being said here. Thank you so much for addressing this. My faith, praise the Lord, he's alive. Things like that. Like they brought Jesus back from the dead by doing this. It almost sounds like if they didn't say these things, that Christian almost walked away. You can kind of feel it in the wording as they're sitting there going, I'm so glad you're like saving my faith here and protecting Jesus from these internet atheists. Anyway, that's why.
Well, I mean, to be fair, you would probably get these sorts of comments even if David Wood and Michael Jones pulled like 10 completely random words and put them in random order, right? Well, no, I think what's very important to emphasize is that, you know, they are talking about Bill Maher. We are not going to be disagreeing with them on that.
Right.
But then they mentioned MythVision. And what's very important to emphasize that we don't actually know which specific videos or which specific scholars that have been featured on MythVision they are talking about. We think there is some possibility that they might be referring to like a recent video that we did, me and Derek, but we don't actually know. They could be talking about Richard Carrier. They could be talking about David Litva, who has been, you know, covering similar topics in the past as well, even though they say atheists and he's a Catholic as far as I know. But, you know, like,
right,
as long as you're not an evangelical, there is a possibility that someone could confuse those categories. And to be completely transparent, I said to Derek that we shouldn't do this because we don't actually know what they are responding to. And the reason why I felt obligated to come here is because to be honest, I don't want to be lumped together with people that I disagree with, right? So I don't want it to seem like, oh, me and Bill Maher, we have the same or very similar opinions about these kinds of things, right? So
Right.
I think that my role today is going to be distancing myself from people that are, I think, pushing bad scholarship. And if I will be mostly agreeing with David Wood and Michael Jones, then that shouldn't be surprising.
Awesome. All right, I'll get this started here. And Derek, I know you're going to have some things to say. I'm sure I do as well. And just stop me, gentlemen, if there's something that's said that we need to address. We are at the 18-minute mark. I put the full video in the description, so if you want to follow and watch the whole thing. I didn't watch the whole thing. My time is so limited editing videos, but Derek was like, hey, check this out, man. Check out this little minute mark, 18:55. But I'm starting a little before when David's using analogies, up to the 30-minute mark. So we're probably going to play through the whole thing at some point during this episode. We'll see. All right, here we go.
Whatever you want. So you can say to a feminist, Muhammad is the greatest feminist who ever lived. And if you're talking to a guy who hates, if you're talking to a guy who hates feminism, Muhammad is the only thing that can save you from feminism. You can just adapt your message to whatever people like. And so you can spread a lot of completely false things if you're in an atmosphere of ignorance. And so notice, if you're walking up to Christians 15 years ago and you say, did you know about Horus, who was baptized by this guy who was later beheaded and he had 12 disciples and all that? Christians don't know about any of that stuff. So they just go, what? And anyway,
I do want to emphasize one thing, right? This is what shocked me when I was a Christian. Zeitgeist, I saw the video. It shocked me a long time ago. I didn't know jack. I didn't know anything. And I thought, man, maybe there's some truth to this. And while it was dishonest and not scholarly, it did play a role on, can we really compare Jesus to other figures? Like, it at least helped me overcome the comparing Jesus to other figures issue. And down the road, I got into real scholarship. So we're in agreement. Horus and baptized 12 disciples and the head and this is what Zeitgeist does. And David Wood loves and knows his Islamic criticisms, but when it comes to Christianity, it's kind of like, apologetics.
Spreads really, really rapidly. And it's just amazing that this is coming from the people who claim to be against spreading nonsense, and yet they're the new champions of complete nonsense.
Yeah, there's a lot of nonsense in this, but let's I even see, unfortunately, some atheists I know online. Like, I've seen stuff on MythVision, unfortunately, and I like MythVision, but sometimes he interviews some people, and I'm like, what? But they're trying to
stop right there.
Okay.
So this is what I find interesting about Michael's response already. Is he's talking about, he sees people on MythVision who take a more scholarly approach, and his initial reaction to this is, what?
Yeah.
So we're not actually dealing with this. We're not getting into the nitty gritty of the data, to use Michael's own term. Teasing you, Michael. But are you giving this a fair shake if your initial reaction, your gut response is just, what? You're kind of dismissing it out of hand from the get-go. You're like, I'm not going to give this any serious attention. I just find that interesting, but you can play it on. I just like to talk. Man, I like me. Go on.
And I mean, this might be us, but again, we are not sure, right? If he's talking about Richard Carrier, then my reaction more often than not is also what? And also, in case he's referring to us, it's very important for me to emphasize that I'm in no way qualified. I'm not a scholar yet. I have a couple of years of undergraduate classical studies under my belt, but I don't have a formal degree. So, and re-listening to some of my older videos, when I make a video that's like 90 minutes, chances are there's going to be one thing that I say that's just completely incorrect. Full transparency, okay? Especially listening to things that I recorded like 3 years ago or 5 years ago. these are extremely complicated topics. It takes really a lot of time and energy and focus to go through the primary sources in the original languages, even in English translations and stuff like that. The skills that you need are very difficult to acquire. So it's just completely normal that people are going to make mistakes, right? And it's important to be transparent about it. And when you do occasionally make mistake, then it's very important for you to own it, even if it's in a major peer-reviewed scholarly publication.
Well, I gotta say, giving the benefit of the doubt, Michael was like, I like MythVision, some of his stuff, you know, I like some of Inspiring Philosophy stuff. I listened to some of his work and I'm like, okay, most of all, and he hears me say this when I call him from time to time, is I like the quality of his editing and the skills he puts into that kind of visuals but I like having someone like him who is taking the best he can from the apologetic world, trying to still reconcile and protect and defend the Bible as best he can. And it is better than what I see a lot of apologetics out there that does. So, you know, it's like what I did with that interview with Paula Fredrickson you saw before I did this episode, Derek. I didn't play the whole part, but I asked her what works of people that you disagree with have been most motivating to you in helping you sharpen the knife, so to speak, on getting better or getting closer to what you think the reality is. And if we don't have those oppositional positions within scholarship, it won't sharpen us to get to that point. And I'm thankful that people like him exist to help me to get better and see where does he have something to this? Does this help me come to my conclusion better? And so forth.
Yeah,
so,
apologetics can serve as a nice corrective to the kind of nonsense that is spread out there. And let me also say that I vehemently disagree with Camille right off the bat. I'm the center of the universe. Everything just kind of revolves around me. So there's no way that he's not talking about me. Come on.
Yeah, of course.
Camille, you're not American enough, man.
All right. No, I mean, I want to second what Derreck just said, and I think it bears repeating because the last time I actually praised Michael. He has a video series of videos where he covers dying and rising gods and these kinds of figures, and he goes through some of the primary sources even. And he, just debunks some of the misinformation that's out there. And I think that's a valuable resource. Of course, it's not difficult to do if given the information that's being, some of the information that's being circulated is so bad. It's like, it's kind of like when we talk about apologists who make claims like, oh, the earliest source for Alexander the Great, it was like 300 years after his death and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Or there have been coinage found that has like microscopic inscriptions which talk about a second governorship of Quirinius, and that's when the census in the Gospel of Luke happened and stuff like that. When you are getting these kinds of claims from the other side, then you are like, let me just make videos about that because it's so easy to address. But no, if we picked one of those videos and we kind of went over them, I'm sure I would be able to spot some things that are not true. But on the other hand, it exists. A lot of the things that it covers is legit. So,
and I want our audience, Camille, this is the thing I hope that people viewing this now and into the future will take into account. Even if details that we might be describing aren't exactly correct. Let's, right now off the bat, on a serious note, Derreck and Camille disagree. They disagree on many things, I'm sure. On this category of dying and rising gods, I know is one of them that they're not, it doesn't mean that they all know for sure that one's right and the other one's wrong. It's that they draw a conclusion based on what they've researched and the way that they approach this. But at the end of the day, whether you want to put a category there or not, both are, it's like the argument I hear, documentary hypothesis, not all scholars agree with that. Some are supplementary, some are fragmentary hypothesis, some are this or that. They all agree there's composite literature here being compiled, not that it's unified and it's a harmonized text. So every academic is in line here and saying, we have problems with the literature, not apologetics to try and make Genesis 1 and 2 a single text so that we can try and make the flood account a single text, not two stories. In every single scenario, we try to harmonize everything, which I've seen Michael Jones do. So this is something I hope that our audience takes away is while they disagree maybe on this or that and this and that, they are comparing Jesus. You need to see him within, I'm going to use the term since we've already been poo-pooing zeitgeist, within the zeitgeist. And I don't mean it in terms of the documentary. I mean it within the cultural, historical context in which Judeo-Christian origins arises out in the Mediterranean and why this is important. So stay tuned. I do want to continue playing. Zachary, thank you for that super sticker. You're going to heaven now. You weren't before, but now you will. Robert Herring says, love you too, bro. I always start religious conversations with, I don't want to destroy your faith, but I'm not going to lie. And I'm a Jew in Christian land. Thank you for that. And Mrs. J became a member. You will have an apotheosis one day for that. I really appreciate you. Seriously, Mrs. J. And then Paul Kickling says, when science develops its refinement, when mysticism develops, it's all fake hypocrisy. Wake up, guys. Why does everything have to be compartmentalized? I think the way that's how we describe things with categories. But I also agree, like what Paula says in one of the interviews, religion, like this category that we're trying to compartmentalize. This is Judaism. This is that. That is a wrong start to begin with in many ways, she said. And so I'm going to listen to the professionals on this one and really consider like, what is going on here? That doesn't mean we can't describe what we're saying is Judaism, but they're living in a Mediterranean world. All right. I had to knock those out. Here we go.
Push a more, I guess I would say, scholarly approach to this idea that Jesus is sort of based off pagan deities, or like he's a Jewish version of like some dying and rising motif from the ancient world, something like that. And it's bad. Let's look at a couple of these deities. We will get how bad this is. So let's take, for example, they'll say Inanna. I mean, in the clip that Bill Maher is about to go through, he's going to mention Sumerian text. So Inanna was an ancient Sumerian deity, Akkadian Ishtar. And they'll some modern atheists will claim that, she was also a dying and rising god, that she was dead for 3 days and 3 nights. I've seen atheists make this claim within the past few months. They'll cite a text called.
By the way, Inanna did appear in my Dying and Rising God video, where I took an article that Richard Carrier wrote, and he does put her in the category with this idea of a god that dies, and then of course it comes back to life. Anyway,
Inanna's descent to the netherworld, or Inanna's descent, and they'll say in that text she descends to the netherworld, she's dead, she does something like a crucifixion where she's hung, and she's dead for 3 days and 3 nights. Anytime someone tells you Inanna was dead for 3 days and 3 nights, has not read Inanna's descent. It does not say she was dead for 3 days and 3 nights. They're taking it out of context. What it says is Inanna tells her servant Ninkaburu, on the day I arrive in the underworld, start making rounds for me, lament for me, get the gods on my side, that kind of thing. Then Inanna descends and she dies. Then it cuts back to Ninkaburu, and it says, after 3 days and 3 nights, Ninkaburu started making the rounds for Inanna. So the 3 days and 3 nights in that text corresponds to Inanna's descent to the underworld, not her death. Because it's aligned with the text of Ninkaburu making the rounds. So it doesn't say she was dead for 3 days and 3 nights. It refers to how long it took her to get to the underworld. 3 days and 3 nights, and then Ninkaburu.
I must ask Derek this one. You and Camille probably disagree on this category again, like I said, but like let's pretend that we're trying to see some bigger type here. Would that make that big of a difference to you, Derek?
Yeah. So first of all, I heard him mention the crucifixion thing, and he's right. Inanna is not crucified. She is hung from a hook. I've heard, I'm not here to name names, but I have heard scholars equivocate here and say that it's crucifixion, and that's misleading. It's not. But he's also absolutely correct about the 3-day thing. It doesn't explicitly say that she dies and she is raised 3 days later. So he is technically correct. It's after she makes her descent into the underworld. There's like 3 days and 3 nights of mourning. So does she indeed go into the underworld and die? Is she killed and hung from a hook? Yes. And as the text does relate, she is effectively raised from the dead. Let me pull up the actual text here. Just one moment, stand by. So, ask Erishkigal, that's the queen of the underworld, for the corpse that hangs from the hook on the wall. One of you will sprinkle the food of life on it. The other will sprinkle the water of life. Inanna will arise. And of course, the corpse is given to these creatures who go down to raise her. The Kragara sprinkled the food of life on the corpse. The Galatur sprinkled the water of life on the corpse, and Inanna rose. And she thereafter ascends back to the world of the living. So this is explicitly a myth concerning a death and resurrection, which is followed by an ascent. It's a little bit different from the way that the Christian mythos is portrayed, in which Jesus ascends from earth to the heavens, and here in the Inanna myth, it's from the underworld back to the world of the living. But what we're seeing here is a structural analogy, and it's not even to say that Jesus is necessarily just a revamped version of Inanna, that they're just copying this, but it does represent something along the lines of this is how this is the kind of mythic phenomena to which the ancients were prone, and it does follow a kind of structural analogy. The whole idea of a descent, death, followed by an ascension, and of course the whole idea of descension and ascension is very prevalent in many of these ancient Mediterranean myths. I mean, even with Christ, and I'm not talking about mythicism or the ascension of Isaiah or anything like that, but Christ does descend to the world of the living, the lower world of death and despair, and is crucified and killed, and then ascends back into the heavens. So there's a structural analogy here in place that does fit. What I see Michael doing is he's basically seizing upon what many online atheists get wrong about the 3-day thing, and in tackling that and exposing that and in dwelling on that, it's almost as if I can debunk this one little thing and call most of your attention to my debunking this, then you can ignore all the rest of what's going on here. It just seems a bit like, I mean, it's fair to call that out because people do say that and get that wrong. But in so doing, it's, can I get you to ignore everything else?
That's exactly what I feel is going on here. So I just want to make a brief comment. If Camille wants to add any notes or make a criticism of that, or even maybe you want to say amen, I don't care. At the end of the day, for me, there's this kind of, there doesn't even need, scratch genetic connection here. Scratch even that they know of Inanna's story. Forget all of that. Who cares? They don't need to know that story. The framework, as you described, there is a structure within all of these mythos that kind of overlap in some ways. And this is the debate you hear even on his channel about Genesis. Where did Genesis, is it literally intertextual between Enuma Elish? Is it borrowing from this tablet or that tablet? Well, he finds any way to disconnect it. So it's not, maybe it's just cultural, it's in the air. And this gives kind of that, like that Jim Carrey scene. There's a chance where many Christians hear this and they go, could Genesis actually be echoing the original story? And that, like, really, could these other myths be borrowing from an original tale that actually happened with a historical Noah? Or could these be true? Like, it gives these people a false impression rather than seeing Genesis. I go with Ronald Hindle on this. It is a reaction. It is obviously ripping apart civilization as a positive thing. They're building civilization. They're building the Tower of Babel. They're building these things in Ur. They're building these things in Mesopotamia. And they're saying, no, it's the shepherd. It's getting away from that and going out into the wilderness with God. This is the proper way of living. And I'm seeing this as a reaction continuously. You see intertextuality in a sense, because you see the release of the doves, or the birds, the 3 specific birds. And there's other examples with the rib, things like that you could see. And you don't even have to argue genetic. You could say it's in the air. And these are the problems I'm finding is while there might be something you can nail down, it's like, look over here, haha, you see? And maybe there's something to it. Forget the big elephant in the room that is, there is something going on here. And I feel like as we go forward, and I'm going to shut up, as we go forward through the playing this and we're conversating, it's like all of these things. Let's divorce Jesus from having any comparison. And where's the question of, did those other figures like Romulus really ascend? Did Asclepius really raise people from the dead and actually do healing miracles? Did all these people really do these things? Because I'm going to tell you what, the people in the Mediterranean world back then, for the most part, believed that they did. And Christians are just doing that with their... So I'm not saying maybe some philosophers who are more intellectual said, these are the myths for the people, but we don't buy that. That's different. The common folk typically believe this stuff.
I would add, though, that I do think it is nevertheless interesting that you have this 3-day motif within a narrative about a divine being who does die and gets raised from the dead. So even if it's not technically a matter of she died, and 3 days later was raised, that's technically correct. It's nevertheless interesting that you find a 3-day motif in just such a tale. And the reason why is because in the ancient world, after 3 days, if you didn't come back after 3 days, there was no hope in any kind of restoration. Your body was gone. So, of course, Jesus is raised on the 3rd day. In the Inanna myth, it's after 3 days that, okay, we better go down there into the underworld and see what the heck's going on and see if we can't revive her. And in the Gospel of John, by the 4th day, well, it's the 4th day. By this time he stinketh. Past 3 days, it was hopeless. So I think there is something of interest here, even if Michael is technically correct about what he's saying concerning the narrative.
Yeah, I don't actually know that much about Inanna, to be honest, because I'm not that familiar with Near Eastern literature, and there doesn't seem to be that many sources in the archaic Greek and archaic classical period and later. She becomes syncretized with other figures, but that is very complicated, right? Like when there is syncretization, there is always a change in the religious thought. Mm-hmm. So you can't necessarily think that, just because we have some primary literature describing the myth from, centuries prior to Christianity, that means that even similar myths still existed by the 1st century. Otherwise I don't think that the 3-day motif is from the ascension of Inanna. That's probably from Jonah, right? Because Jonah is also a story about revivification.
Yep.
He is swallowed by the fish and he dies, and then God, or at least I think that's what you're meant to take from the story.
And
he's not
Hosea 6. I think it's Hosea 6:3 that Israel would be restored, torn to pieces, but restored on the 3rd day. If you ask me, I think that's coming straight out of Hosea. Nevertheless, it's still, you have this 3-day thing in Hosea. You have it there in the story of Jonah. This does seem to be a prevalent motif in the ancient world. So you could say it is kind of cut from the same cloth of, the ancient significance or relevance given to this 3rd day business, whatever that is.
Yeah, I mean, 3 days show up probably more often than other numbers, right? It's how often is it 5 days? Probably not that often as 3 days. Uh, I've been looking at some sources for this idea that after 3 days you know for sure that the person is dead, or that the soul or the spirit is hanging around the body for 3 days. Earliest I was able to find, honestly, and maybe you could have some earlier sources, was the Talmud. But that's quite light, to be honest.
Mhm.
I wasn't able to find anything. And in some cases, there are other numbers. I think in the myth of Er in Plato, the guy dies and he has a vision of the, or he goes through the afterlife, right? That's actually really, really similar to the Second Temple Jewish and also like Christian revelations, where you have a person who is basically gets a tour of the afterlife. He gets to see all of these various places. He sees how it works like in the afterlife and stuff like that. And either it's a vision, or he then comes back so he can report on what he saw, and that's like a source of information for people to know how the afterlife gets operated. But actually, interestingly enough, in Plato it's 12 days. He's out for 12 days, which isn't 3 days, but hey, 12 days is also interesting number, right? It's not probably it's more often 12 days than 11 days if we were to count this kind of significance. I'm not sure about Inanna.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, this whole quest, it is a lot to try and dig into. One of the interesting things is we talked about Jonah and the 3 days, 3 nights. And I always ask, where did that story get its information? Why is it taking place, first of all, in Nineveh, right? We have Assyria was really bad to the Israelites, and you have this fish god. And I was looking at Dagon, like the previous mythology of a fish man. It's half fish, half man. Dagon, this fish god. And there's academic sources to go and look into. Like, for example, an article by H. Clay Trumbull. And anyone who's interested in looking at like where do academics think these narratives come from. So there's just, we can debunk details or disagree over a detail. You made a lot to do with that, Derreck. That's not technically, that category is different, or that's a different myth and whatever. But what about it being a myth? Like, what about it having legend?
Also, something that bears commenting on probably more than once is that I think, if I'm not mistaken, they specifically said that the hypothesis is that Jesus is based on other deities, or that he's a Jewish version. Yeah, that's exactly not the way how to think about it, right? Because I think a lot of Christians, including apologists, like David Wood probably thinks that as well, and they can't get out of this mindset, is that they are imagining that what we are saying is that Jesus is a bootleg version, that someone like made a conscious effort to manufacture a Jewish version of some existing deities, or it's like a deliberate copying. That's not what we are saying, and I don't think that's very plausible. Kind of it's a bit difficult to think about it for people today, because unlike in the ancient world today, religions, especially in the Western world, tend to be very they tend to be parceled into specific boxes, and inside these boxes they tend to be very rigidly organized in terms of institutions, doctrines, systematic theologies, and stuff like that. So you have different denominations of Protestantism that are each like very neatly and clearly defined. You have Roman Catholicism, which also is like a very precisely tweaked thing. It's very concrete. You can read the catechisms, you can read the doctrines and stuff like that. Well, in the ancient world, it wasn't really like that. Religious thought was much more fluid, and it was much less institutionalized, and there was much more plurality and room for invention. Kind of that there is one area of Western spirituality that is sort of like that today, and that's alternative spirituality, the thing that people call New Age, right? And if you just think about how it works, it's a bit similar like in the ancient world, where in Western alternative spirituality, you have a lot of the same concepts or similar concepts that are repeated. So you have things like karma, energies, healing crystals. You have quantum woo, people using terminology from quantum physics to express like spiritual ideas and stuff like that. But it's not systematized, and individual gurus or individual practitioners, they are going to be using similar concepts. They are maybe going to be using them in similar ways, but they're not going to have any system, right? And definitely not across these different individuals. So basically every practitioner is going to be like a different mix of these ideas. And I think that's more similar to the ancient world, right? So when you think about Jesus, think about like a hippie friend who has a package of religious ideas, which is similar to like a different practitioner of Western alternative spirituality. They are using the same vocabulary. They are influenced by some of the same sources, like Deepak Chopra, Jordan Peterson. They are, some of these ideas are coming from the East, like from Buddhism, maybe Hinduism, reincarnation, and these kinds of things, right? But it's very fuzzy. It's very fluid. It changes from person to person and over time. And that's more similar to how this like culture enculturation worked in the ancient world.
I 100% echo what you said.
100%. I will say, Camille, you were asking about earlier sources on the 3-day thing. I do think it's interesting that in the pyramid texts, this is prominent concerning the death and resurrection of the king or the pharaoh, modeled on the death and resurrection of Osiris. Here from the pyramid texts, "O my father Osiris the king, awake, stand up at yonder eastern side of the sky at this place where the gods are born, where there comes this time of tomorrow and this time of the 3rd day. My father the king will be born on yonder eastern side of the sky where the gods are born, when there comes this time of tomorrow and this time of the 3rd day."
Okay, I would probably need to reread that a couple of times to really understand what it is saying.
By the way, Derreck's internet has demons. Everybody pray for his internet during this live stream. For some reason, it glitches out and happens to do this. Let me get through these super chats here real quick while he disappears. He's going to have an apotheosis, but the gods are going to reject him and send him back down. How serious is the global warming? Are the apologists making it worse? I'm not going to blame apologists for the global warming. The only criticism I could say is factoring in the fact that we need to start taking care of the world we live in is some fundamentalist, and I would not put Michael Jones in this category because he obviously thinks we evolved, all of these things. But many fundamentalists are like, screw this world. We can't wait for the world to come because this one's just going to be destroyed by fire and stuff like that. I don't know whether or not he thinks the world is going to end by fire or not, but the point is he doesn't act in this way, and I've talked to him in the past. Derreck, I'm just going to get through these super chats, so we're going to play another clip and continue because we've got much to cover here. And Zachary Johnson says, for 1,000, would you rather play chess with Frank Turek or Ken Ham? Like, meaning I'd get paid to play with them? I mean, I'd play with either one of them for $1,000. I don't care, But who would I probably tolerate more in that? I would imagine. I don't know, man. I've met Frank before when I was at a Christian apologist conference. So he was pretty chill at the time. Of course, I was a Christian, so maybe that plays a role. Ken Ham, maybe? I don't know. He seems really like chill too, but he's a fundamentalist as well, so it's hard for me to know. What do you guys think?
Well, you don't have to think about it at the heart. Like if I was offered $1,000, I would just lose as quickly as possible, take the money, and then it doesn't matter who you're playing with.
Yeah, I think I'd just drive off of a cliff myself.
Oh, thank you so much, Zachary. And then Avros, good to see you in the chat. It's been a while. Apologists overlook that Gospels do exactly what they complain you are doing. They saw these typologies in Old Testament, which reminded them of Jesus' life, real or made up, and connected the dots, mimetic influence. I mean, yeah.
Well, to be fair, like Inspiring Philosophy is pretty open to this kind of thing, right? Like some of the he thinks that a lot of the things that are fulfillment of prophecies in the New Testament are basically people retrospectively looking into the Hebrew Bible and finding things that kind of sound like what Jesus did. I think probably some of the details in Jesus's life are invented based on, so that it becomes fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy in this way. And we see that not only in the canonical Gospels, but later in Christian literature, right? It doesn't stop with the canonical Gospels. Like subsequent writings add more and more details so that they become fulfillment of these prophecies. But I would, for example, ask him, well, what do you think, where does the idea of the harrowing of hell comes from? It's not in the canonical Bible, right? In the canonical New Testament, at least I don't think so. But in later writings, like the Acts of Pilate, it describes that when Jesus died, before he was raised, he actually went physically to hell, and he brought the souls of the righteous that died before his crucifixion from hell. And that sounds like suspiciously like these stories of physical ascent to the underworld. Like, because one way to get to the afterlife is that you are killed, or you can just physically walk there, because it's a place, just like heaven is up, the underworld is a physical place that you can walk. Yep. And throughout the Mediterranean, there were specific locations which were known to have gates.
I went to one in right there in Caesarea Philippi, right where the Temple of Pan is. And I saw where the water, it's like a spring that comes up and down throughout the year. They believe that it was a portal down into Hades. And Jesus, according to the Gospels, was there saying, "Who do men say that I am?" So, you're right on the money.
Yeah, so... And of course, a lot of Greek heroes do that. And not only Greek heroes, I think Inanna also gets to the underworld in the first place to be killed there just on foot, right? Through one of these openings, presumably. Like, would he be open to the idea, of the story or the concept of Jesus harrowing hell being influenced from these myths, given that it's not in the New Testament? So it's not part of the word of God. It's something that Christians invented later, right? I wonder whether that would make a difference. That would be a good question to ask him.
You want me to go ahead and
continue? Go ahead.
Okay. All right.
We started making the rounds, that kind of thing. It also doesn't mention anything like a crucifixion. She's pronounced dead by the gods of the underworld. And then they take her dead body and they hang it on a hook. Then eventually the god Enki sends down these genderless creatures to resurrect her, kind of, so to speak. But really they just give her some sort of special water or a plant, depending on the version you read. And she comes back, and then she's got to spend half the year in the underworld, and someone's going to take her place, kind of thing. So her descent in that whole structure corresponds.
So again, just... nonverbal language, nonverbal communication says every bit as much as verbal, if not more, actually, than verbal does. Just notice the way that he has to portray this and the way he talks about it. It really says something about the mentality. Yeah. He's got to downplay the fact that she was indeed bodily resurrected. Resurrects her. Do we have a problem with her being... Forget that. But he also says that this is only a cyclical thing for Inanna, where she comes back, but then she has to go back to the underworld, and someone takes her place. That's actually utterly false. What she does is she when she comes back to the land of the living, she finds her husband Tammuz, who's lavishly dressed, enjoying slave girls, hadn't been mourning her at all while she was gone away and dead. And so she gets pretty upset, rightfully so, right? Come on, men, what are you doing? So she has Tammuz actually descend to the underworld to take the place of someone else. I think It's her sister Erishkigal has to be there in the underworld for 6 months, and then alternating Tammuz has to be there in the underworld 6 months. But Inanna herself does not return to the world of to the underworld of the dead. She stays alive and raised. So he's factually incorrect about that.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that.
And I'm also
not just
wondering
some sort of
where
like physical
else.
death.
Do what?
I'm also wondering where else the concept of immortality granting food shows up. You know, the tree of life, because
Yeah, I was going to
gods,
say the Epic of Gilgamesh, of course, talks about this as well. But yeah,
nectar and ambrosia, the place where the gods live, very often a mountain like the Garden of Eden has food that if you eat it, you are going to become immortal. And some people become immortalized because they eat this food. Either they find it somewhere, or they are given the nectar and ambrosia by divine beings, and that's how they are immortalized. So yeah, in case of Genesis, it's a tree in a garden, but is it just a coincidence that
I mean, let me add to what you're saying here, Camille. Is it a coincidence that Jesus says, if you do not eat my flesh and drink this food, which has come down out of heaven, you will not live forever? I am not saying Inanna, Genesis, Epic of Gilgamesh, whatever mythology, it literally is identical in no way. But as I've heard Derreck say, and I'm on board with this evolution over time, as people go from agricultural cultures to more philosophical, individualistic religion over time, and I'm using religion and categories here that really don't get to the nitty gritty, but it's about personal salvation, where we have salvific cults that are specifically about mimicking and becoming just like the gods, that evolves over time. Jesus tells them to eat this food which I give you. You'll never hunger again. You'll never thirst again. We can't think that if we are granting, and I mean, this is really, I don't even want to pretend that this is history or this isn't history. I don't want to act like either way. The text says, let's just go with that. The text says, Jesus says this. If you look at Genesis, let's just go with the Bible's interpretation, since a lot of apologists won't look at the Mediterranean Greco-Roman mythologies as having impact. If we look at the Bible, can we not think he's thinking tree of life? Is it not plausible to think Genesis is what he has in mind? But he is truly the last Adam, as portrayed theologically by these texts in the New Testament. So here's the last Adam giving you the tree of life, which the book of Revelation indicates he was the tree of life. Like this is the idea that Jesus himself is where salvation is. I would say multiple things have evolved is all I'm trying to get at. And can we not at least see that? Even if they're not identical, is there not a connection in some way? What would you say?
The analogy that I like is think of something being cut from the same cloth, or think of two chocolate chip cookies that both come from the same sheet of, chocolate chips and dough. Two cookies are going to look, and these two cookies that come from that same sheet are going to look an awful lot alike. Are they identical? No. One might have more chocolate chips than the other. One might be bigger than the other, but they're coming from the same sheet of dough. It's that kind of thing where these are things that are extending from the ancient world and the way that the ancients conceived of things in that time and place in history.
I want to just, this is what happens when radical fundamentalists enter your chat, because there's no reason someone would get derogatory like this unless they're being triggered. And their heroes within the apologetic field, I suspect, are being criticized. So that's the only thing I can imagine. I don't know. I can't say that you're a Christian, but how do you say you're a Christian without telling me that you're one? I imagine that is it. And Avro says, if myths are not identical, it doesn't mean the influence is not there. In Crito, Socrates says he'll die on third day, and Jesus asks for a cup to be removed from him, which is reminiscent of Socrates' death.
I'm not sure about that. Is it really true that they have to wait for the ship to come back from Greece 3 days?
I don't know. You are in the you're the one who's into the classics here, and especially the Greek material, and I want to hear what you find out. This is your area, man.
I feel like it's the exams. No, it's I mean, it says in 1 Corinthians 15, it's according to the scriptures, right? So if you can explain it with Jonah, for example, then there you go. And then you can ask where the 3-day motif comes from in Jonah, because that's
Right.
in the ancient Near Eastern culture, right?
Right. Well, thank you, Averos, for the super chat. I would love to see what you come back with on that one over time, Camille, if you ever look into it more. Zachary Johnson, thank you for the super chat. Just let everybody know, or everyone know, I used to be addicted to hokey pokey, but I turned myself around. And this is true.
That's
of
a
course.
tough thing to do, but you did it.
I did it. You did it. We both did it. So
You did it, Zachary.
after 3 days and 3 nights, I came back, so.
So we are an hour in, and how many seconds have we covered of the video?
Let's do it.
And resurrection, but with the vegetation cycles. They'll try to say things like Baal is a dying and rising god. They'll try to make this argument. The problem is all of our texts on Baal are highly fragmented, and scholars are quite divided on if Baal is a dying and rising god. Some say he was, some say he wasn't. But there was actually recently an Arabic inscription that was found much later, which references Baal. And it's in a paper called Echoes of the Baal Cycle in Sephadio-Hismonic Inscriptions. And it doesn't say that. It says Baal is cut off indeed, but not dead. So it references the Baal cycle, but it doesn't say he was dead. So he probably isn't even a dying and rising god. So we just don't see any. I say all that.
Yeah, I wanted to get through it at least so that you can address this. And
right. So Baal almost certainly was a dying and rising god. What Michael does here is he mentions a later, and notice, I don't know, did he say later or did he say much later?
I don't know.
Whatever the case, it's much later. Arabic inscription or text that says that Baal is cut off, but he is not dead, does not die. Yeah, it absolutely does. This is to completely ignore the fact that you had variation among these different stories and among these different myths, and you had it in Christianity as well. But if you actually read the Baal cycle, he is unequivocally dead. If it'll allow me to pull this up from the actual text and keep me online with you. Let's see here. From the Rosh Hashanah text, Mott declares, and the gods will know that you are dead. Baal was found dead in the land of Debir. El lifts his voice and shouts, Baal is dead. Anath weeps for him and buries him, and she puts him in the grave of the gods of the earth. He's unequivocally represented as dead in the Baal cycle. And then, as Michael notes, the texts are fragmentary. There is major lacunae. So, if there is a moment in which the Baal cycle described Baal being raised from the dead, we don't have that. It is that part of the text is missing. But it's kind of like I say, there are two types of people in this world. Those who can extrapolate from incomplete data.
Did we lose him again?
No, I think that's on purpose.
Okay, sorry. I thought I literally had
You're not listening.
No, I was pulling something up because what you said, Derek, made me also think of something, and we don't ever hear this category discussed, but I thought of about Zeus here. Acts chapter 17, right? This is a real, if we're going to do something, let's get into the text, right? So Paul, and I say Paul as an author of Luke Acts, quotes Epimenides, and Epimenides' quote was another philosopher as well. And let me just bring that up here. Actually, that might be the best way to do that. Is just share the screen and get into what I think is going on. Let's see. Is this? So the first quote is talking about we live and breathe. Epimenides was a Cretan. This is where the Cretans think that Zeus is dead. They have like a tomb for Zeus. And you're thinking, hold on, like I never, as somebody who's never studied this or even gone into the ancient world, there were people who actually believe that Zeus died. And my question is, like, who is this poet that's writing going, no, Zeus is alive. He will never die. Like, or he remains alive forever. I don't know. Did he die and rise? It's just a question of mine, because in this apologetic in Acts chapter 17, as he is kind of this poet who, I love the way Shelley Matthews points out, at this time to be a manly man, you had to have great speech. Like they portray Paul as if he has this eloquent speech. In Paul's letters, he tells you himself, I am not great with lofty words. I don't have words. Like I'm not good with my speech. But Acts has him have this amazing speech. And he quotes this according to this book. And you have to wonder, why is he equating this tomb with Zeus and then painting it to these pagans in Acts 17 if there isn't something analogous even to Luke, Acts author, in making this point that Jesus rose from the dead and lives forevermore? I wonder, do you happen to have any insight on that, Camille?
Yeah, it's relatively obscure, but even today you can go to the cave in which Zeus was buried. I think that's still being showed to tourists. It's I'm not sure if it's the same cave that was believed to be the cave in antiquity. I don't know if there's a continuity, but yeah, that exists. Because these myths have different variations, right? And you correctly point out that not only the Book of Acts, but also other Christian texts draw a parallel between Jesus and some of these other figures in their argumentation. Everyone knows Justin Martyr. He says, "Oh, when we say that Jesus died, rose from the dead, and ascended to heaven, we say nothing different than what you say about those that you call the sons of Zeus." Theophilus of Antioch does it, Origen does it, and stuff like that. And these apologists don't say your myths didn't happen. They don't deny their historicity. They just argue that, or at least not usually, but they just go on and argue that you should actually pledge your loyalty to this person as opposed to those, right? Because those are like demons, or the myths were planted by Satan in order to thwart the actual Son of God when he comes and stuff like that. And but to go back to the video that we are critiquing, even if it was true that Paul didn't die, that wouldn't be a legitimate criticism of the concept of the dying and rising God, because even the people who think that it's a good framework, which I'm not 100% sold on, actually say that it's kind of a misnomer, because some of these deities don't actually die. Like even Richard Carrier, for example, says that one of the defining characteristics is not necessarily that the deity dies, but they undergo some kind of passion or suffering. And he says it's usually a death, but not always. But the key in the concept is that through that passion, through that suffering, they overcome death in some way. They achieve victory over death in some way. And then they are supposed to share that with their followers, so that, that it's got this salvific dimension to it, right? So yeah, Romulus didn't die, but he would still technically be a dying and rising god, right?
Wow, thank you for that. Really appreciate you giving us that comment. Rum Runner, real quick. Derreck, MythVision should challenge Wood to go on modern day debate. Derreck has better facts, arguments, and I might add a better beard. Well, thank you for the compliment on the beard. I've been letting it ride out. I try, but I'm not a debater. Just not. I don't mind having a dialogue. I even offered, I didn't want to block you from being visible, Camille. I offered to have these conversations, but I'm not this guy who wants to debate for one or two reasons. My ego. I don't like to puff my head up and end up in this, I'm right and you're wrong. It's better to have conversations where it's not tribalism 101 for me. And number two is, who knows if I change my mind on certain categories over time. So I've been wrong in the past, and I don't care to go out there and be, this pretty much my argument would be, here's what these scholars are saying, and here's why, and it'd be like all scholarship, and it would just be pretty much culminating everything, combing through my channel and contacting academics to put all this into one spot and let people hear, like, you want to argue, you're not arguing with me, you're arguing with experts, like overwhelmingly consensus experts that aren't apologists with axes to grind here, and giving you historical analysis. So I really appreciate that. I'd rather have a conversation with the guy and have a conversation with Mike Jones and see why we disagree. Also, a couple more here, real quick shout outs as we move forward. And we're almost through it, by the way. We've got like 8 minutes left of recording. The Mythic Life. Thank you, Kristen Whitaker Hood, for showing up in the chat. You really showed up for Derreck Bennett, not me, but I love you either way. Don't feel bad. Remember, Idaho, not Idaho. It's an inside joke. Happy holidays, guys. Anything in the nativity that borrows from common mythology tropes, slaughter of the infants, etc. Well, of course. Yeah, the Moses story.
And also, David Litwa has a really interesting chapter in Jesus Deus, where he points out that Christianity is unusual because it has a divine conception which doesn't involve a physical penetration. And sometimes this is claimed to be unparalleled in the ancient world. You know, we have demigods. So we have divine offspring, people who are, one of their parents is a god and the other one is mortal. And when it happens, it's through normal sexual intercourse, because gods in the ancient world have humanoid bodies that are like physical, tangible, with body parts. They are anatomically correct. And so they can have sex, right? Mm-hmm. So first of all, it's not true that this was unparalleled. And even, again, for example, Justin Martyr says that, if you think that virgin conception is weird, well, that's what you believe about Danae. So Justin Martyr puts the conception of Perseus into the same category as the divine conception of Jesus. But also, and this is what David Litwa points out really nicely, that by the time the Gospel of Luke specifically was written, it was already inappropriate to depict gods as enjoying physical sex. Because a lot of these stories about gods abducting beautiful women and having sex with them to produce ancestors of important aristocratic families, they usually come from very old traditions, like late Dark Age or Archaic Greek period. But by the 1st century, it actually became inappropriate to imagine that a god is the sort of being who would enjoy physical intercourse, because there is passion involved. You're not, like, when you are doing it, you're not fully in control of your emotions and stuff like that. And that was something that was kind of out of line with how these people imagined gods operating. So again, is it a coincidence that by the time we see this shift in how people are thinking about a god, a new religious text that is being written also has the same motif,
right?
That, Mary isn't physically impregnated. She is just overshadowed. There is divine pneuma, there is divine power and stuff like that. And David Litwa even points out that some of the terminology that's specifically in the Gospel of Luke in the Nativity, which is the most detailed description of the process, is actually a technical terminology that was used by 1st century natural philosophers, 1st and 2nd century philosophers. He gives an example from Plutarch, biography of Numa Pompilius, the second king, who was descended from a nymph. And he says something like, it's not appropriate to imagine that there was a physical sex. Actually, there was this divine pneuma. In a different text, he mentions these divine conceptions being done through divine power. And it's the same, in Greek, it's the same terminology that the author of the Gospel of Luke uses. Again, how would Michael Jones explain it? What's the best explanation? What's the explanation that's most plausible, that has the best explanatory power and scope for these kinds of patterns? Is it just a coincidence? Like, should we think that all of these other myths are like fiction, obviously, and just human constructs, but this one happens to be true?
It seems like a lot of apologists go that route today. The more sophisticated ones we're talking to, our friend Caleb Jackson, I don't think, and I could be mistaken, Caleb, maybe you could tell me one day on the phone or on MythVision, that you believe these other stories happen. In fact, most of the time I'm discussing these things with him, like I'll bring up Apologist or something to go, well, when's our earliest source for that material? It's late, isn't it? Like they're actually trying to divorce those having historical credibility because their apologetic approach to the New Testament, they're trying to keep that, oh, this really happened. I wanted to give a quick little snippet for that $20 super chat real quick here. Suetonius, Lives of the Caesars. Now, while the birth isn't necessarily a pneuma birth as described by Litwa and Plutarch and comparing it to this situation, it's still in this funny category of like the god himself isn't portrayed as sleeping with Augustus' wife or Augustus' mother. Sorry. And now that we're on the subject, I've repeated this before in the past, but this is like an important part in comparing the whole killing the child narrative that we find. You would think, oh, this is only in the playbook of the Moses narrative, right? No. Let me skip down here. Drone in the hope of an expectation of his greatness, enduring good fortune. When in ancient times, part of the wall of Villatre had been touched by lightning, this was seen as a sign that a citizen of the town would one day be ruler. Bolstered by this, the people of Villatre immediately waged war against the Roman people, and on many subsequent occasions too, almost to their own destruction. Finally, however, it became clear this event had been a sign predicting the power of Augustus. Julius Marathus records that a few months before Augustus was born, a prodigy was generally observed at Rome, which announced that nature was bringing forth a king for the Roman people. The Senate, think of this, the Herod, right? Like the people in power, political power. The Senate, he continues, was most alarmed and agreed that no child in that year should be raised. Well, what do you do if your wife is pregnant? What do you do to the child? You kill the damn kid. So it's so clear right here. He's like trying to eliminate these children. However, those whose wives were pregnant ensured that the decree was not registered in the treasury. She didn't have that baby. Let's raise this child and hide this child from the Senate, the government. And of course, it goes on to say, since each hoped that the prodigy referred to his own child. And notice it's his. Anyway, I read in the books of Asclepius of Mendes entitled Theologomena that Atia, attending the sacred rites of Apollo in the middle of the night, had her litter positioned in the temple and fell asleep while the other matrons were also sleeping. All of a sudden, a serpent slid up to her, then quickly went away. And then, of course, she's pregnant 9 months later. She has Augustus, and, you know, that's
so
just one.
Are you telling me that Caesar Augustus is a rank Raglan hero?
I don't even get into the rank. Man, I don't even need to get a category like that. Like, dude, it's so obvious, though, to me that, like, it's in the air. Any author, any educated writer would have known, would have been aware of these tropes and probably, I would imagine, the philosophical thinking that you described earlier. So, Kristen, thank you for that. Did you want to comment on that, Derek, or did you want to get back into the juicy stuff here?
We'll get back into the juicy stuff here. We'll wrap this on Baal, let him say his piece, and I'll respond.
Yeah, because I want to hear Romulus too. We're both going to get into that as well. Here we go.
To say we don't see any evidence of this sort of strong motif that Christians could have been trying to play with or turn Jesus into a dying rising god. And even one of their own scholars, Trygve Medinger, that argues there were dying and rising gods in the motif. Like he tries to say Baal is, and he makes an interesting case, but I think Mark Smith has a better one. He concludes his book, The Riddle of the Resurrection, saying there is no evidence.
Just to wrap on Baal here, I was making the point that, I mean, he is unequivocally dead in the Baal cycle from, Samaria. It even depicts Anath burying his dead body. He's dead. And so we have this, this missing portion of the text that doesn't really describe what happens next. But then a little later, we see that he is fully alive and even in battle with Mott once again. So, it's like I said, there are two kinds of people in this world, those who can extrapolate from incomplete data and those who can't. What do you suppose happened here? Clearly, he must have been brought to life again. I mean, that's the only thing you can really reasonably conclude. What Michael touches on here is that, you know, Trygve Medinger makes the case that Baal must have been.
No. Okay, remind him when he gets back where he was at, because I already know it's going to kick him and then he comes back. The demons are strong with him today. Aaron Adair, thank you for the super chat, Dr. Adair. And good to see you here. For your information, the person who likely invented story that Zeus was immortal and buried was Euhemerus. Interesting. In the 3rd century BC book, Sacred History.
Yeah, that could be true. I don't know off the top of my head whether there is like an older tradition, but it's not super popular. And Zeus is interesting because even though he is the top deity, there was a large variation in how he was depicted and like what kind of properties he had, and to a point, like geographic variation, for example, and in the mythology. So it's to a point where you don't necessarily even know whether the people believed it's the same figure or whether they thought there are multiple different Zeuses, right? For example, I think Xenophon, before he goes to join the campaign with Cyrus the Younger, he offers sacrifices to 2 different deities that are both named Zeus, but he forgot a third one, and that has some negative repercussions, right? So apparently, not only is there more than one Zeus, they can't even tell each other that, oh, it's okay, he sacrificed to us, so, you know, he doesn't have to do it for you. No, you have to cover all of them.
Thank you so much. Derek, you said Medinger. Is it
Trygve Medinger?
Yep, you were going into that, and then the devil.
So yeah, Trygve Medinger makes a compelling case against Mark S. Smith that Baal is depicted as a dying and rising god. John Day in his Yahweh and the Gods and Goddesses of Canaan comes to the exact same conclusion. But as Michael Jones is correct to note that there are scholars who have a different interpretation. They do not think that Baal actually died and rose in the Baal cycle. But when you look at the arguments that are presented, Medinger's case is easily the most compelling. It makes the most sense of the text. I'm not simply favoring one or over the other because I'm an anti-theist who wants to use this as a defeater against Christianity. No, as I always say, I'm a truth seeker first and an atheist second. So I just want to know what's true in this case. And frankly, Medinger has the better argument. As he says, Baal, of course, was the god of thunder and storms and lightning. He is told by Mott to bring his thunder and lightning and clouds with him into the underworld when he descends. So Baal descends into the underworld. He's definitely dead for some time. And then the next thing you know, there's no storm, no fertility, no crops. This is a signal that he has died and his powers are now lost. So when we see him alive in combat again with Mott, he has clearly been made alive again somehow or another. So what Mark S. Smith attempts to do is say this is representative of the Ugaritic kings. So this is not really depicting death and resurrection. But as Medinger points out, that's, for one thing, it's a bit of a red herring. What does it matter what the background is? But on the other hand, it's because of the seasonal fertility associations that this must be depicting death and resurrection in analogy with the death and rebirth of crop life. And that doesn't make sense on the sacred king motif. So Medinger just has the better argument here based on the data. That's all there is to it.
I love that you bring this out. So I want our audience, we're going to continue listening. Go read the material, listen to Mike Jones, and go check out what Mark Smith says, because Mark Smith is a awesome scholar.
Yeah.
And then go listen to Medinger. Go read and check out the Baal cycle for yourself. Make up your own mind. You might come in the comment section and say, hey, ontologically, I agree with you guys. I'm on Mark Smith's side on this. Cool. That's fine. But it's worth investigating, and we're not trying to like pull one over on you or make you like look over here and ignore all this. No, we want you to look at it all. Look at it all. All right, here we go.
For the death of dying and rising gods as vicarious suffering.
Okay,
like, as
can we
vicarious
go back
suffering
just a
for
little
sins.
bit.
Okay.
But it doesn't say he was dead, so he probably isn't even a dying and rising god. So we just don't see any. I say all that to say we don't see any evidence of this sort of strong motif that Christians could have been trying to play with or turn Jesus into a dying and rising god. And even one of their own scholars, Trygve Medinger, that argues there were dying and rising gods in the motif. Like he tries to say Baal is, and he makes an interesting case, but I think Mark Smith has a better one. He concludes his book, The Riddle of the Resurrection, saying there is no evidence for the death of dying and rising gods as vicarious suffering for sins. There is, as far as I'm aware, no prima facie evidence that the death and resurrection of Jesus is a mythological construct drawing on the myths and rites of the dying and rising gods of the surrounding world. The death and resurrection of Jesus retains its unique character in the history of religions. So Bill Maher is just wrong. Even some guy who argues there may have been dying and rising gods says
I actually agree with that.
Okay.
I actually agree with that. Yeah, no, I think like one of the biggest weaknesses of the concept of dying and rising gods is that they go beyond the concept of what actually happens with the person after they die. Because I would like where I see the biggest parallels is that there are individuals who, instead of going through the normal afterlife, so dying, going to Hades, going to sleep, being annihilated, whatever, instead of that, they are just taking to like from the realm of ordinary humans. Their status in this metaphysical hierarchy is very highly elevated, and now they continue to exist as divine beings who deserve worship. Sometimes they appear to people, tell them things, stuff like that, right? So basically what happens to Jesus, that's the similarity. But the concept of the dying and rising gods goes beyond that, and it tries to argue that in these other cases, the point of the suffering or the point of the victory over death is salvific, basically. It has some kind of eschatological or salvific dimension. And it's very easy to misconstrue as saying that the concept is about vicarious redemption, is about saying that, oh, Dionysus or Romulus or Baal undergo passion so that their death or suffering atones for sins of people. But that's not actually the case, right? Or the evidence isn't there. Or at least not for the kinds of figures that are usually proposed in the kinds of sources that I've seen. That's the issue, right? But I think it's very important to disentangle, to disconnect the metaphysics, what's actually happening to Jesus in the Christian lore, because I think that has a really strong parallels to the Mediterranean culture, specifically by the 1st century, with this idea, with the motivation for Jesus dying. Because it would be very difficult for me to find parallels for the idea that someone sacrifices themselves to atone for sins of some community, if not all people everywhere ever. There are some parallels. For example, a lot of people point to the suffering servant in Isaiah who dies not for other people, but because of other people. And that's very easy to basically get that confuse, right? So you interpret the passage as saying that, oh, he dies for other people. Then you have this idea in the Second Temple period. Why is it the case that righteous people are being persecuted by the Seleucids, like rabbis who are supposed to be righteous? Oh, it's because they suffer on our behalf, right? That gets you to that idea. And there is also, for example, the Greek ritual of what's the name? Pharmakos, where a community, like a city-state, takes a criminal. They have him walk around the city. All of the sins of people that were committed in the city get transferred to him, and then he's either killed or he's expelled. He's usually killed in myth. Scholars of Greek religion don't think that Greeks actually practiced human sacrifice. Sometimes they said they did, but what actually happened in the ritual was some kind of substitution. So instead of killing the criminal that's carrying all the sins of the community, they just expel him from the city, and that cleanses the community of all the sins. But it's not a divine being, it's just a guy, right, who's playing this ritual role. It is repeated usually every year, and it's not for all of humanity, it's just for this one particular community. But again, is it a stretch to imagine that someone living in that culture would think something like that, but with a god forever, for everyone? Seems plausible, right? Like it's the kind of religious invention that you can imagine people in that situation plausibly making.
So just can I recap what you're saying for our audience?
Absolutely.
To kind of get so Derek, I want to get your thoughts on this. And what you're pretty much saying is, while I think you're going to have a lot in common with Derek and looking at the Mediterranean world and trying to compare martyrdom or like you described, someone wicked in the community is causing the whole community to be going to crap because of their wickedness or whatever they're doing. The gods aren't happy, you name it. Oh my gosh, I think we lost Derek. Bear with us. We'll be coming back with Derek here in just a minute. I did want to bring this up. While I agree with you, the category specifically you're describing, there's a lot more detail to it that is going on within the Christian bubble here on what is being discussed. But I love this book because Candida Moss actually goes in and gives, she wants to show the category of martyrdom, while it just means witness. And of course, these are witnesses typically in a court case, because Christians obviously appeared often in court cases and were condemned if they didn't find a way to cooperate. But they're dying on behalf of their community, or they're kind of a symbol of people that you want to embrace. They become saints, whatever the reasoning is, and going to heaven. But she shows previous Greek heroes, you can call them humans, who end up dying on behalf of the people because the gods aren't happy. All right, Derek, what I was going to say is that there's like a special, there, according to what Camille's saying, while you guys are going to have a lot in common, Christianity does something a little more unique in the sense that it just kind of tweaks some of the points here. And it has kind of a Jewish, and then yet we're kind of combining multiple things. So in a sense, it is unique that it kind of does multiple things that other things around it may not be doing. But I do think that, Camille, you said some things that I could say, hey, I found that in the Mediterranean world. Oh, I found that in the Mediterranean world. There's some stuff here that kind of makes up the Frankenstein we call Christianity, which has some unique components. Derek, give us your thoughts.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, Christianity is essentially a Greco-Judaic hybrid. You're going to have elements in there that are Jewish in orientation that you don't find in these other myths or cults. So Michael Jones is correct to point out that, yeah, Jesus's death is a vicarious suffering, an atonement for sin. And you don't find that in these other dying, rising God or apotheosis type myths. That's absolutely right. Where I do disagree with Camille, actually, is when you're pointing out that there's no salvific connection at all with these other dying, rising God myths. That's just not
depends
true.
what you mean by salvific, right? Because that's going to do a lot of heavy lifting.
Go ahead, Derek.
Okay. So actually, you do find that, for instance, as these Egyptologists discuss with regard to the resurrection of Osiris. So it's not a vicarious death for the sake of sin, but the resurrection itself does serve a salvific purpose, in that it makes possible resurrection for all of the ancient Egyptians who are raised in his image. As Louis Zakbar says, just as Osiris was killed and rose to new life, so the dead king identified with Osiris through the recitation of the spell is made alive again. In other words, what we have here is the bodily resurrection of the dead king. Osiris provided a model whereby the effects of the rupture caused by death could be totally reversed through the mummification rites, which incorporated an assessment of the deceased character. The Egyptians hoped to be revived and justified like Osiris. Make sure I'm still with you guys here.
Yeah.
So yeah, Osiris is every bit a savior god, in that his resurrection makes it possible for others to be raised and justified in his image. So the resurrection there does serve a salvific purpose. And we see this basically getting syncretized into the cult of Dionysus, or at least Orphic Dionysus, where just as he was killed and rose to new life, so the initiates in the Orphic cult could be, following their death, reborn in the image of Dionysus. So there is a salvific element here, though it's not the Jewish type of atonement for sin. As far as the actual death is concerned. Yeah.
And would we both agree, while you may not completely agree on these details all the way, you seem to nod in some sense, you might not care for words like justify or whatever, sometimes these Christianizing terms. But the thing is it wrong? I'm going to kind of go out on a limb here. Is it wrong to so capitalize on those differences that, hey, we got a Judeo-Mediterranean hybrid here, or Mediterranean is not the proper term here, Greco-Roman Judeo religion. It's a hybrid. And because it does this different thing, it has a little bit different waddle of its walk than the other ducks. It's not a duck. And it's the real duck, by the way. The other ducks are full of shit, but ours is true. That's the issue I'm finding as I get into this. We're going to get into Romulus next. Make a brief remark, and then let's get into him diving into Romulus, if you don't mind.
It's also important. It's important to emphasize that there are many aspects of Christian theology that are unique, even in the Mediterranean world. But that's also true about all of these other examples that we are coming up with. So it's not the case that Jesus is uniquely unique. Like, all of them are unique in some aspect or another. For example, we mentioned that the motivation for why Jesus is killed, him being an atonement, is something that's unprecedented. Well, the motivation for why the people that I'm talking about, that undergo divine translation and become divine beings, the motivation for why they have to die, or why they are, taken from the human realm and become divine being, that's also different from myth to myth, right? There are some like similarities and repeating patterns, but you can actually construct several different categories precisely because of these differences. And when everyone is special, nobody's special.
Well put, Camille. And I think Derek, me and you agree on this. And you guys have done far more studying on that. Derek, you had a comment you were going to make, and then we'll just dive into the video, or do you want to go?
So Michael does quote Trygve Medinger in his book, The Riddle of Resurrection. He does there toward the end, or kind of in the conclusion, that there's no prima facie evidence that the myths and rites of the dying and rising gods were a direct influence upon Christianity. I do think it is worth noting that Trygve Medinger is a Christian. So that in and of itself, not to commit a genetic fallacy here, right? He's a Christian, therefore he's wrong. He must be mistaken. But it does give one reason to be suspicious. Naturally, he's going to come to that conclusion. He's not going to say otherwise. On his website, I try to draw a line between what I believe I know as a scholar and what I know I believe as a Christian. That's Trygve Medinger. So of course he's going to say this, that when it comes to the death and resurrection of Jesus, we're dealing with something utterly unique that he probably does think is actually historical. So he does pretty well in terms of being unbiased in his coverage of this whole dying and rising God myth theme, but he's going to retain a special place for Jesus because of his faith commitment. That's perfectly natural. Other scholars who have since opined, since Trygve Medinger, that's from 20 years ago, the book that he wrote, such as John Granger Cook, see this as right in the vein of, let me just go ahead and quote Cook toward the end of his discussion of the topic. Let me pull that back up here. As Cook states, his comprehensive survey of the dying and rising gods indicates fairly clearly that the category of dying and rising gods is still useful to describe the vicissitudes of a number of ancient divinities, and thus the thesis that the concept as dead cannot be sustained, just as the Greek of the LXX in New Testament has its place in the matrix of classical Greek, so the resurrection of Christ can be placed in the matrix of the bodily resurrections of cult figures from the Mediterranean world. And Nathan Nadeau, in his Greek resurrection beliefs and the resurrection of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, he basically reaches the same conclusions, concurring with John Granger Cook that this is very much a motif that was alive in the ancient Mediterranean world. And it does have reference, at least by analogy, to the death and resurrection of Christ.
Thank you. Camille, you said you looked like you were about to jump in there and want to say something. Do I need to keep moving on, or are we going to get stuck?
No, like to kind of balance it, I'm an atheist, but I would agree with the quote that, specifically with the quote that Mike quoted, because like Jesus seems to be unique in terms of his death being a atoning sacrifice. Definitely, if you think it's an atoning sacrifice that covers everyone on the planet.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. All right.
And death of Jesus is nothing like these motifs or anything. There's no way we could even think that this is some sort of copy or part of the ancient Near Eastern motif of dying and rising gods. The scholarship just doesn't support this notion.
He added a lot there,
and it's just weird because, I mean, think about it.
And other scholars
Romans
sing a
crucified.
different tune.
Yeah.
The more recent scholarship sings a different tune.
Yeah.
And if someone were, brought to them as claiming to be some sort of king and so on, or Messiah or something like that, and they were worried, or they just wanted to calm people down, not a lot to make us think that they wouldn't crucify someone like Jesus. And so it would make perfect sense for Jesus to be crucified. And so I mean, put it this way. If you're going to say, Jesus was crucified, therefore it must have been stolen from this earlier, this God who was supposedly crucified because the God was put on a hook or someone. I mean, are you going to do that with all the crucifixions? Like every record we have of people being crucified, it's copying a... Like, I understand if you're an atheist, a naturalist, you want to avoid the supernatural elements and so on. But the basic story of a guy, and he had, Jesus is going around, he's got his disciples, he gets crucified. A few days later, they're claiming that he rose from the dead. These are things that even atheist scholars regarded as facts about Jesus. But the sort of out of touch internet atheists, they're even explaining that stuff away, like historical bedrock of Jesus, and they're tossing that into the myth category and doing a really, really lame job of it.
Okay, I want to
let me actually see if Michael Jones pushes back against this, because it's very, very obvious that David Wood is not tracking the conversation.
Well, I was going to say, I think we all three on this video right now agree with the assessment of the historical bedrock being there that this guy gets crucified within this context. But we're also dealing with literature, and we're also dealing with people in this time who literally believe people do go into the underworld or do ascend on high. They literally think this is just the world that they lived in. So there's nothing wrong with saying there's a guy. But I think he is still dealing with the Bill Maher stuff and the zeitgeisty kind of taste.
Okay. I mean, this is actually really important to separate, right? Because like the easiest way for an apologist to dismiss it is to conflate it with Jesus mythicism. Like, as soon as you suggest that some element of the story, for example, Jesus being enveloped by a cloud on his way up to heaven, might be like a common trope that was really common, like in the primary sources, specifically in and around the first century. Well, they will say, "Oh, you just think that there never was a guy; he was never crucified, or do you think that every crucifixion was based on Inanna? Come on." That's the way how they do it, right? Like here you can kind of excuse it by being charitable and saying that at this point he's still responding to Bill Maher. I don't know if he's a mythicist. I don't know if Zeitgeist is explicitly pushing Jesus mythicism, right? It's drawing these connections in order to conclude that Jesus didn't exist, right?
Yeah, and we want to set the record straight. We want
Yeah.
people to not, go off with extreme views, even on the skeptic, atheist, naturalist, whatever. And I actually agree with David on trying to, be factual. But I think what's happening is there's two extremes. There's no middle ground. And so we're trying to like meet in the middle somewhat here. And we're hoping the apologist will grant us, try to come in the middle. Like you said, other people ascended in the clouds. Can we meet in the middle here and say, is this a trope? Is this legend? We think there's a bedrock as well. I think all three of us on this channel right now think there's a bedrock, that there was a guy who got crucified by Rome.
What's also important is that, like by the same logic, you would have to dismiss the historical existence of people like Caesar Augustus, because the kind of things that we think are made up about Jesus of Nazareth were also made up about people who actually existed, right? Romulus is fictional, almost certainly, or he's so fictional it doesn't make sense to say that he actually existed, right? But Caesar Augustus didn't. So like that doesn't, what he's saying doesn't also make sense on that level,
Right. Yeah, fair balance. Here we go.
Well, I mean, if Jesus was a copy of these dying and rising motifs, we should see evidence of literary borrowing. Like we see that Matthew is trying to paint Jesus as another Moses figure. Let me write, like people do this today. They try to write, about a Barack Obama as if he's a new Abraham Lincoln. People do this all the time. Matthew tries to do this with Jesus. Like he's a new Moses figure leading Israel into the Exodus or the Promised Land, this kind of thing. So if they were doing that, we should see this type of literary borrowing. To give you a pretty clear example of where this shows up, in the ancient Near East, there's the Epic of Gilgamesh. Everyone knows this tale. And in it, there's a flood account. We know that the author of the Epic of Gilgamesh got his flood account from an earlier work called the Atrahasis that also has a flood account. Why? We can see direct evidence of literary borrowing. He's borrowing terms, the way of writing in this specific passage on the flood, literary borrowing. Same with the Gospels. We see they're clearly drawing from the Old Testament. Jesus fulfilled this. Jesus fulfilled that. Literary borrowing. We don't see any evidence of this in the New Testament when it comes to pagan deities. They're not drawing from the tales of Romulus or Asclepius or any of these deities. They're not. And so what mythicists or people who think this motif exists have to go off like these vague associations. Like, oh, well, Asclepius healed people. Jesus healed people. Coincidence? No, because deities did.
I was going to say, if we let him ride out, we could really pick all of this stuff apart. But we're almost there at the end, so don't worry. All right.
Yeah. So notice the way that he frames this. I mean, he just strawmans it all to hell. Asclepius healed people. Jesus healed people. Coincidence? Yeah, that's not really it. That's not it in its entirety. With Asclepius, not only did he heal people from sickness and disease, as Justin Martyr tells us, he healed the lame, the blind, and the paralytic, and raised the dead. He was the paramount raiser of the dead in the ancient Greek world. Coincidence? Might be. The Gospel of John. The Gospel of John depicts Jesus performing his healings at the Pool of Bethesda, which was where the Asclepius cult was quite prominent and well known. This is, as M. David Litwa points out in Jesus Deus, a classic example of the kind of one-upmanship that we see in the Gospels, where Jesus explicitly is being compared to these other gods like Asclepius or Dionysus, but we're saying we've got an even better version. Jesus is he's like Asclepius, he's only better. He's like Dionysus, he's only better. And the only way you can do this kind of competitive assimilation or one-upmanship is if, frankly, you are aware of these other myths, as the gospel authors surely are. And so there is some kind of an impact or influence. I don't think it is a coincidence that Asclepius both, healed the sick, the lame, the blind, and the paralytic, and raised the dead. That you see this showing up in the Gospels. And these are authors with Greek educational backgrounds who have read Ovid, Livy, Herodotus, and so forth. They know of these myths, and they're doing a newer, better version. So I think there probably is something more here. Yes.
I would like to also mention, as was mentioned in the chat by Kristen Whitaker Hood, about Dennis MacDonald's work, which we've talked about this before, Camille. I've also spoke to Cam about this as well. And Cam's a big fan of like getting into this mimesis, seeing what's going on here. Like this has been the criticism that Dennis has said 1,000 times. And in fact, it was just now repeated by Michael Jones. He said, we see it is written, or this is fulfilled, which means it's clear that the Gospels are literarily, mimetically, or at least somehow connecting to the Hebrew Bible or the LXX, better yet. And what Dennis says is, if you go and you read, Aeneid, the Roman version of the Iliad, Odyssey, and you'll see the Aeneid does not quote ever the Odyssey or the Iliad as it's rewriting it for the Roman people. Never quotes it once. And he goes, but we know without a doubt that it's using that. It never goes, thus it is written in the Iliad, or thus it is written in none of that. That's phraseology you would find in this, what we would call uniquely Judeo-Christian hybrid of literature that we find, where they're using the LXX. But we do have illusions. We do have certain things that he would say connect us to that world, and saying, hey, we should take this seriously, especially when in order to learn Greek, you had to know this. So you don't have to say, all right, let me open my Iliad today, roll the scroll open. All righty, we're going to go ahead and copy that part right there and copy. You don't have to do that. It is in their conscious. They are aware of this, as Derreck is saying. And I think that is what's ignored. That is what isn't picked up. Camille, you mentioned the clouds, right? The whole ascension in Acts 1. Where did we find this? Are we going to go to the LXX to find any possibility that someone was taken up in the clouds? We're going to try and say, well, Elijah got taken up. Yeah, it was in a chariot, but we need to fit it within the Bible. We got to keep our Bible to fulfill what he's doing in Acts 1. Instead of looking at contemporaneous examples in the Mediterranean world of figures, heroes, gods, God-men, you name it, that are taken up in clouds. What do you say to that?
Well, it's actually interesting that in the 1st century, where Josephus rewrites the story, he gets rid of the chariot. Because just like physical sex, people riding to heaven in chariots by the 1st century would be perceived as inappropriate. Because, that's not the kind, that's like a theatrics, right? That's what's being depicted in like Greek tragedies on the stage, where you have these Deus ex machina, machines that are manipulating gods. So Medea, for example, rides on a chariot at the end of all those plays. But by the 1st century, like if you are aloof Greek intellectual, no, you think that the person disappears, like Jesus, or he just floats, right? And then he's enveloped by a cloud. And he uses some of the same Josephus uses some of the same vocabulary for this divine translation that's being used in these other authors that are writing in the 1st century about these stories, not just about Greek and Roman, but also, for example, about Egyptian cases, also about Babylonian cases and stuff like that. And some of the same terminology is actually used also in, for example, the Gospel of Luke or in the Gospel of John. And then it's like, he's like, on one hand, he says there is no evidence, but on the other hand, he dismisses the evidence. Like, there is a person who, instead of dying and just going through, like, to the underworld, he was taken from Earth. He now exists as a god or as a divine being. Like, he has a position that is much, much higher than what ordinary people achieved at the moment. When he was exalted, he received a divine name. He deserves worship. After he ascended, he appeared to people on Earth. He talked to them. He gave them instructions. He revealed what happened to him. Who am I talking to? Who am I talking about? Am I talking about Jesus? Are you sure? You want to double check that? Because what I've said fits pretty well with what's being described in the New Testament, more or less, right? In John, for example, Jesus says to Mary, I haven't ascended yet. So that's a little bit different, right? But are you really want to make sure that I'm talking about Jesus of Nazareth? Because I could be talking about a lot of different people. And again, is this just a coincidence? Like, how do you explain it? I don't have enough faith to believe that it just happens to be the case that specifically in this period of time, and specifically in this relatively small region of the world where we see these kinds of stories being told, like, all of them are made up except this one that's actually from the real creator and sustainer of the universe, right? I think a much better explanation is that this is just another story that was being told about famous philosophers, about athletes, about founders of cities, about rulers, all kinds of people. Prophets.
Well put. Derek, I think we lost him again. He's going to bounce back. And Averos has something here. I really wanted to play something that I found fascinating in Joshua Bowen's book that was edited by yours truly, who's in the chat, Dr. Kip Davis. So for those who are interested, Dr. Kip Davis is, of course, a Dead Sea Scrolls scholar, but he helped edit this volume, volume 2 here. Chapter 7 about plagiarism, or this idea of copying, borrowing. And just to give you the conclusion at the end of the day, he does think there is borrowing, but what is meant by that, there's no literary police. I mean, we don't even know who the authors are of some of these works, and they're not trying to say we own copyright to this material so you can't use it. And so when we hear people say borrowing, I think what most atheists mean is, like, come on, man, this is not so unique, right? And because what's happening is Christians are acting, or even biblicists, whatever you are, saying our book is right. We got the true book. Ours goes back to the beginning of creation, yada, 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 whether you're Orthodox Jew, whether you're Christian, whatever. And atheists are typically going, dude, no, you like literally are borrowing, or this is like coming from, this is not an original source material. Like Genesis creation is coming from something before. So Averos, thank you for that super chat. Noah myth is borrowed, but no credit given in Old Testament that it was borrowed. And Jesus is Jewish reconstruction, borrowing from Hellenistic myths without credit given. I don't expect credit to be given, and none of them, I don't think, were giving credit about any of this stuff. I mean, it's just in the air, and it was things that were being borrowed. And you did something interesting here, Camille. I wanted to play a short just to give people a teaser. I know Dr. Josh will not mind me doing this, but it's the Cloud Player to his book, The Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament. And what he does at the beginning is amazing. So if you haven't got this book, here's a plug for him. Let me take down the super chat so you can actually see Camille too. Here we go.
Chapter 7. Did the Old Testament plagiarize? Part 1. Introduction. I deconverted from Christianity in 2009 during my first year in the PhD program at Johns Hopkins University. Leading up to my deconversion, I had been the associate pastor at a church in Virginia, responsible for, among other things, several in-depth studies into the biblical text. I was asked one Sunday in 2010 to fill in for one of the Sunday school teachers and lead one of the adult classes on something from the Old Testament. I thought it might be a good idea to present some of the difficulties with understanding the Hebrew Bible in its wider ancient Near Eastern context. My message was essentially, things are more complicated than you think, but there are good scholars working on the problems. Although I was not convinced by the solutions provided by these evangelical scholars, I thought the congregation should know that these issues were known to the academic community and scholars were able to maintain their faith in spite of them. I had trained the people of this congregation to trust the Bible as the inspired, inerrant Word of God, down to the very letters. However, I had come to see that there were significant problems with this position. By showing the congregation that these problems existed, but that well-trained Christian scholars were able to maintain their faith in spite of them, I thought it would be an eye-opening and encouraging experience. I could not have been more wrong. I opened the class with a PowerPoint, as was my custom. On the screen, there was a passage from the book of 2 Corinthians, but without any reference to the book, chapter, or verse. It was not a well-known or common group of verses, and I chose them for that reason. Who are my serious Bible scholars? I asked with a smile. Who can tell me where these verses are from? After only a moment or two, several hands went up, and the class was able to identify the passage from which these verses were taken. I then clicked to the next slide, and a section of Ezekiel chapter 1, the passage about the wheels, appeared on the screen again with no reference to where it came from. What about this one? I asked. Again, with little delay, several people in the group were able to identify the chapter. If there's one thing that you cannot take away from fundamentalist evangelical Christians, is that they know their way around the Bible very well. I then pushed the small clicker in my hand. I was such a professional, and the following lines appeared on the screen. The seventh day when it came, I brought out a dove. I let it loose. Off went the dove, but then it returned. There was no place to land, so it came back to me. I brought out a swallow. I let it loose. Off went the swallow, but then it returned. There was no place to land, so it came back to me. I brought out a raven. I let it loose. Off went the raven. It saw the waters receding, finding food, bowing and bobbing. It did not come back to me. As you might imagine, it took only a few seconds for most every hand around the room to go up. Some people were feeling a bit left out. Everyone knew this passage from the Bible, right? I mean, who hasn't read the famous story of Noah and the worldwide flood? That's the flood story, Genesis 6 through 9. Everyone nodded in agreement. I then clicked the button one last time, and the citation slowly faded onto the screen. Epic of Gilgamesh, Tablet 11, lines 147 through 156. Stunned silence. After what seemed like an eternity, I broke the silence by saying, and this story predates that biblical story in one form.
And he goes on, got to get a copy. There you go, Dr.
Well,
Josh.
it's kind of manipulative, right?
It is.
to be perfectly honest. No, I mean, just to get to back to the question of whether you would expect it to be more explicit, like whether you would expect people to draw some explicit connections, whether you would expect the authors to like make specific references and stuff like that. Again, like, is that something that we see with these other examples, with these other figures that I have in mind? Well, in some cases, yes, right? Like when Ovid, for example, talks about Romulus, he might name drop Caesar Augustus to kind of connect them together. Or when he's describing Caesar Augustus, he might say something like, oh, just as Heracles was, or Hercules was taken to the gods, so did Caesar Augustus, something like that. But most often than not, no, right? It's not going to be explicitly tied to any other figures like that. It doesn't need to be. You're supposed to pick that up because you are in that culture. You are raised in it. Not every superhero movie needs to have like Easter eggs pointing to Superman, for example, or to some of these other like precursor superheroes.
Yeah, well, I like that. I like what you said there. Derek, did you want to comment on that, or do you want me to keep playing till we pause? Or
keep going?
Okay, and then after that, I'll make a quick bathroom break while you guys are chitter-chattering. Here we go.
It happened. So they'll do things like that. Like Romulus was taken up to heaven in a whirlwind. Jesus ascended into heaven. Well, coincidence? Well, yeah, there's a motif in the ancient world of deities going up into heaven. I mean, if you're going to go that far, then the account of Romulus being taken up into heaven by a whirlwind is a copy of the prophet Elijah being taken up into heaven. And no scholar would make that connection.
Yeah, I mean, using this method.
No, no
okay,
scholar would
I'll be
make...
right back.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. Yeah, like we are not saying there is a genetic link between how Jesus's ascension is depicted and how the ascension of Romulus is depicted. Just like scholars don't think there is a genetic link between the ascension of Elijah and the ascension of Romulus. But a lot of scholars would probably say that there was just a way how to think about these things and how to create narratives that display them. And that's why these parallels exist, right? So actually, like what is being supported by scholars is exactly what we are also applying to this case. It's not a coincidence that Romulus being taken to heaven is similar to Elijah being taken to heaven, and analogically, it's not coincidence that Romulus being taken to heaven is analogous to Jesus being taken to heaven. So we are actually being consistent, right?
So yeah, I think it's absolutely important to make that distinction between an analogical comparison and a genealogical comparison. Some of what I'm talking about, for instance, especially with some of the dying rising gods that I endorse, I am making analogical rather than genealogical comparisons, per se. But on this point, I think that Michael Jones is completely wrong. And I think that once again, he is downplaying the significance of what we're seeing here. What he does is he only mentions the being taken up in a cloud, that one single parallel, and says, really, just this? That's all you've got? Is that enough? He's missing much more of the story here. And no one better demonstrates this than Dr. Richard C. Miller in his Resurrection and Reception in Early Christianity, and in his article, Mark's Empty Tomb, and other translation fables in classical antiquity. It is not just a matter of Romulus being taken up just like Jesus was. Dr. Miller points out a whole slew of mimetic signals that do seem to place the gospel narrative within the tradition of Romulus. And I'll break them, or just at least share the number.
I can actually share the screen.
You have the same thing up, or?
Yeah, I do.
Will allow me to share the screen here. That's a good idea.
If it kicks you out, I'm gonna be so angry.
No, I can do it. I can share the screen. I have it up.
Share screen.
I have it up.
Here, is this it, Derek?
This is mine. But you have
okay.
You have.
Are you seeing this?
Well, right?
Hold on, I don't see it. Hold on 1 second. Let me see.
I think it's better if we do it on my end, because you might drop.
You know what? That's a good idea, Camille. Go ahead and pull open that article.
Yeah, so we have a missing body. Romulus doesn't die, or at least that there are, as with actually the Gospels, there are several different versions of the story floating around. So just like there are people who think that, the disciples just stole the body, there are also people who think that Romulus was murdered by a conspiracy of the Senate. And that's how he disappeared. Like, his body disappeared because after he was murdered, the senators chopped his body up and hid the pieces. And that's why he's nowhere to be seen. But in the alternative version, which is what supposedly happened in the mythology, he is ascended. So he just disappears from Earth, right? We have a distant body. We have prodigies. So his translation is actually foretold in advance. That is a motif of darkness over the land. He gives a speech on a mountaintop. He gives a great commission specifically to Proclus. So he appears later to a Roman noble. He reveals his identity. He tells him who he is. He tells him that he has a new divine name. And then he gives Romans commission. He tells them what they are supposed to do, what their ethical imperatives are. Of course, being Romans, it has to do with conquering the world, right? But that's explainable by these cultural differences. He ascends to heaven. He's a son of a god, in this case, Mars. The meeting is on a road, which is parallels. There is an argument that the appearance to Proclus parallels specifically the appearance to the two disciples on the road to Emmaus. There's eyewitness testimony, so Proclus actually testifies before the Roman Senate that this is what happened, and that's like a legal basis for the Senate decreeing, recognizing essentially Romulus as a deity and officiating his worship, temples being built in his name, rituals being performed, festivals and stuff like that. He's taken away in a cloud. This is something that I've talked about last time. People in the ancient world had a particular way to depict disappearance. So they didn't do it the way how we do it in movies, where you just like fade away. When someone disappears in the ancient world, they disappear into a cloud. So they are abstracted from vision. They just don't like disappear like the transporter beam in Star Trek. So again, is it just a coincidence that in the one text that describes specifically Jesus ascending to heaven, we have this motif also, given that this is how people did it back then? I don't think so. There are dubious alternative accounts. So again, and this is, by the way, a very, very frequent element, right? I have hundreds and hundreds of examples now, hundreds and hundreds of specific passages that have to do with this divine translation. And there are two elements that are extremely common. As soon as someone mentions that someone was translated into a divine being, they say two things. First of all, they say that the person is being worshipped, and they usually go on to describe the worship. So they say, oh, they have a temple here, or this festival is being performed in their name. They are being honored by these sacrifices and stuff like that. It's almost always tied very closely together, usually in the same like paragraph or in the same passage. And the second element that's almost always there is there are actually multiple different accounts. One of them has the divine translation, but the other one explains it, you could say, naturalistically, right? So, in one account, the person is translated and becomes a divine being, but then there are alternatives that are consistent with them not actually being divine beings. And there are reasons for that. It has to do with how people had a tendency in the ancient world to rationalize myths and to kind of bring them more in line with everyday human experience. Euhemerization of mythology is, for example, along the same lines. We have an immortal heavenly body. It's outside a city, okay. People flee. So there was a specific festival that commemorated ascension of Romulus called Populi Fugia, where actually the whole thing was apparently ritualistically performed. And there are several sources that say that. And one of the things that was performed was this flight of the people. You can imagine it like celebrating Easter, for example, in here in Central and Eastern Europe. We have Passion Plays. You probably have that as well in the US, right? Mm-hmm. Where you kind of recreate the scenery. And of course, in this case, the flight of the people would parallel the disciples' scattering. You have deification, of course. By the way, Romulus pre-existed because he wasn't just a human being who became a god after he died. Romans believe in pre-existence. They believed that these people who were deified were already divine before they were born. It's just for a brief period of time, for one human lifespan, they were born to mortal women, and they lived on earth as human beings. And after they died, they returned to the divine realm. It's actually interesting. You can see it very clearly in Latin, because unlike Greek, when Latin writers write about this, they use verbs that have an element of repetition. So they say he returned, right? It doesn't say he went to heaven. No, he returned to heaven, because he was already there before he was born.
Oh, wow.
Belief, homage, and rejoicing. So there is like an element of some cognitive resistance. So people don't buy it. People are confused. They don't know what's happening. And then there is recognition, and then there is rejoicing. Bright and shining appearance. That's also interesting. Again, Romulus, when he appears in full body armor. Jesus doesn't do that, even though there are depictions of Jesus as a warrior, of course. But again, it's explainable. Like, it's a different matrix of religious symbology that has to do with how the deity is different, how it performs in its religious framework, right? So these are we have more. People are frightened, or Proclus is frightened, or both. All in sorrow over loss, so people are grieving before they realize what happens. Inspired message of apotheosis. I don't actually know what this is supposed to be. What is missing here, and I don't know why, is divine name. And this is something that I also mentioned the last time. Jesus receives a divine name that he apparently didn't have before when he's exalted. The divine name is Kyrios, the Lord. We have it in Philippians 2. And Romulus also receives a divine name, Quirinius. And what's interesting is that in both cases, the reason why this divine name is received is the same. Both Jesus and Romulus have this divine name because they need to be merged or syncretized with previous deities. So they're probably, we don't know because sources on Roman religion are relatively scarce, especially early on, but there probably was an already existing Roman deity named Quirinus. And when the Romans started worshipping Romulus as a god, they just merged the two. And the way how this was depicted in mythology is that Romulus received this divine name. So he became again the god Quirinus. And the reason why Jesus receives the divine name Kyrios in Philippians 2 is to solve the question of how is it the case that Jesus can atone for sins if in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, it says repeatedly that the only salvific agent, the only person who can atone for sins is Kyrios, the Lord. Of course, the solution is right there in Philippians. Jesus receives the name Kyrios when he's exalted. So he now has the authority or the prerogative to forgive sins. And all of the passages in the Hebrew Bible that talk about the Kyrios being the only agent who can forgive sins now apply to Jesus, so that's fine. And Paul pretty much says this explicitly in Romans as well. So that's another parallel that's missing. A lot of this, I think, is pretty weak sauce. So I wouldn't posit like a genetic link between Jesus and Romulus. But if someone made me bet like a large amount of money on whether there is a specific deity that at least the Gospel of Luke is being modeled on, like, so if someone told me there really is a genetic link with one of these examples and you are going to win a prize if you guess correctly, then I would probably guess Romulus. But I think, yeah, not sure. Like, I wouldn't argue for a genetic link necessarily, but it's really interesting.
That is,
and you have to also. It's important to frame it specifically in the context of the first century, right? Because what was happening in the first century is the beginning of the Roman Principate. So Romans have just finished the conquest of the Mediterranean world, and they were ruling pretty much the entire known world from the perspective of people in Judea with an iron fist. And there was a sustained imperial propaganda of imperial deification. So this ruler of the world was being depicted. There was like a systematic cultural attempt to depict him and people around him, his predecessors and his like subsequent emperors as divine beings. This is something that early Christians knew about, and this is something that the gospel authors knew about. Like when Jesus is handed the denarius and he says, to Caesar, that belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God. The denarius literally had an inscription saying, a son of God. It would be a denarius of Caesar Tiberius. And on denarii that were minted with Tiberius, it literally says, Deus Filii. Filius Dei, a son of God, son of a god, because his predecessor, Caesar Augustus, was a god.
right.
So you have to imagine, like, you have to keep in mind, this is something that, for example, John Dominic Crossan talks about, that this is the culture in which the people lived in. And it's not really implausible to believe that someone in the position of the gospel writers would try to push back against this and they would try to create like a countercultural figure around Jesus. And this is something that, for example, Richard Miller also goes on, like the framework of his book, Resurrection and Reception in Early Christianity, is colonial and post-colonial theory. It's a framework for analyzing how in environment of colonialism, there is a cultural interaction between the colonizing culture and the culture of the people that are being colonized, and how sometimes the people who are being colonized try to subvert the culture of the colonizers.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the ways how you could subvert it, if you are being ruled by the Roman Empire, is like intentionally depicting the hero that you identify with as sharing similarities with the deified emperor, but also depicting him differently, better, contrasting him, depicting him as more Jewish, and these kinds of things. Again, I'm not saying like this is like 100% truth, but it's at least something that one should consider.
There's a whole slew of things to open up on this, and you covered a lot there. Derreck, did you want to add your thoughts? Maybe even just say amen to a lot of the things you heard, I suspect. But yeah, feel free to add to this, and then we'll continue I'll hit our super chats, then we'll continue and we'll wrap things up.
Amen and move on.
Amen and move on. Okay. David Gagnon, forgive me if I butcher your name. If Jesus was just a myth, why make up the rigmarole about the census that caused Nazarene Jesus to be born in the city of David? Why not just write that he was from Bethlehem? It seems he was a real person and everyone knew he was from Nazareth. You're talking to a group of people who think that there was a Jesus. I think you guys would think he was from Nazareth. I think he was from Nazareth.
This isn't as strong of an argument, unfortunately, as people might think, right? This is like one of the go-to arguments of historicists, but actually there are like several reasons why it could be the case that even Jesus being from Nazareth has reasons other than him actually being from there and being a historical figure. For example, the Gospel of Matthew says that Jesus being from Nazareth is a fulfillment of a prophecy. It's not a prophecy that actually exists in the Hebrew Bible, so that's a bit suspect, and there are things going on there. But it could, for example, be the case that there was a text that the author of the Gospel of Matthew considered scripture, which contained a prophecy like that and was subsequently lost, so we don't have it today, right? So Jesus being depicted as coming from Nazareth, and there being two separate, very convoluted stories about how it is the case that he's also from Nazareth and also being born in Bethlehem, isn't necessarily like a very strong evidence for historicity.
I think he was probably from Nazareth, but at the end of the day, I also wouldn't be shocked if Matthew was reading something mistaken. I wouldn't be shocked if he's bending things. I mean, he can't even get the idea in Zechariah 9:9 where it's like, this is one donkey, and he makes it into two. So like there's a lot of stuff that he may be reading. Something sounds like Nazarene, and he might be interpreting it to be a fulfillment somehow, and it's really Nazareth, which is a real location. There's all sorts of stuff.
I also think he was probably from Nazareth. It's not like a silver bullet against Jesus' mythicism, right?
Hey, thank you, Zachary, for the super chat. Democrats are right socially, Republicans are right economically. That's why America is divided. This isn't a political channel. I do appreciate your support.
That's what we've been saying. I mean,
we did not lose Derreck again. Oh my goodness.
It's probably for the best in this case.
Yeah. Zachary, I appreciate the love and the support, man. But yeah, we are trying not to go there. We tried to focus on the topic at hand. Thank you so much for the support. All right, we'll pop the video up. We won't play it till Derreck comes back from his apotheosis. And really appreciate that. Appreciate that. Come on, Derreck, disappear and come back already. And once he disappears and comes back, we will know that this is well known within the zeitgeist of online interviews in the world around, that people disappear all the time. And you kind of have to wonder why, right? Why does Derreck keep disappearing? In this case, it's not that he's a god, it's that his internet sucks. Do other people have bad internet in the world that disappear from live interviews? It's not common, but it happens. It's not as common, I'll put it that way. If you look at all my interviews, how often do people disappear due to the internet? Anyway, trying to be funny, wasting time here, waiting for him to come back. Do you think God exists? Not believe.
Which one?
Someone says Derreck is a divine man. So yeah, I don't personally believe God exists. Could there be something that we kind of use the category to define for all creation? Maybe. I just don't personally fall in that. So Derreck, I'm glad you got cut off, because I told them, like, we're not a politics channel and we're just not going into political stuff. But you were saying something and then you were taken away, my friend.
Oh, no, I was wondering if we could take the next 20 minutes to dovetail into politics, if that's cool with you guys. And also,
you have to come to Nathan's channel for that. This is where we drop
and then
all the
also, I
political
think
hot
Jesus was probably originally from Missouri.
Right.
The whole Mormonism thing, I think they depict him coming to Missouri, but that's in order to explain the fact it's a post hoc what's the ex post facto explanation for his actually being originally from Missouri. So I just wanted to get that out there. And then, does God exist? Of course he does, but I want to sin like a mother, so I just deny it. Whilst I, puff white stuff off of dead prostitutes. Jess. So,
oh, you're horrible. You're horrible. Okay, we're going to wrap it up here with this. I think he ends on Romulus. I just want to make sure that we get through this. We'll hit a few super chats and then make sure that we plug you guys.
You could explain any actually historical figure, right? You could pick any historical figure. So Obama, George W., Biden, Bush. I mean, any of these guys. You could point to any of them, and then find people before them who had similar characteristics and say, you see, it's a copy. This person is a myth. And it's just an insane methodology. And then you look at what they do in order to arrive at that, and how they got to twist all this information about these gods, and just the silliness of it. I mean, one, you had Jesus was obviously a first century Jew. He had followers. He was crucified. His followers were later claiming that he had risen from the dead. If you ask them what's going on here, they're appealing to Old Testament prophecies and to information that was available to everyone, right? So they would say, this wasn't done in a corner. Crucifixion's a public event, and they're saying we're the witnesses of him. And so the information they're sharing about Jesus, it's based on things that people in general knew or things that they knew, and then claims of fulfilling Old Testament prophecy. So the idea that these guys are sitting there, hey, let's pick some details about some of these Egyptian and Sumerian gods, and let's put together a story.
This is exactly what I'm talking about, right? Like, David Wood has absolutely no idea what is it that we are talking about. Like, I'm sorry, he's just not part of the same conversation. Like, if I thought that this is the only alternative to the God of the universe being Jewish, then I would probably be a Christian. But that's not the only alternative, right? Like, if you staying a Christian is, if what's necessary is thinking that this is like the best and the most robust objection that anyone can make, then I'm sorry, but it's pretty weak sauce. You'll have to do better than that.
Derreck, I'm going to end on that because it goes, but I think he went once again back to the extreme form of these are just copies. Like someone got a Xerox machine and went out there and like just made Jesus and made him.
Not only that, but he like what he's imagining in his head that we are saying that the most probable explanation is that Jesus's disciples, after he died, got together and said, hey, why don't we copy this Inanna and Baal and we mix it up with some like Jewish bits and I don't know, ... profit? Okay, like cool story, bro.
Derek?
Well, yeah, David Wood was on one there for a moment, but the video then proceeds to the last point that.
Do you want me to fast forward it?
Go ahead and if you give it just a moment, Michael Jones will make his last little
about our guy.
Okay.
I mean, how does that even get off the ground, right? Like, it's one thing to share a myth and people know that it's a myth, right? It's something else to say, this guy over here, you're saying this in the first century, mind you, this guy over here was just crucified. And he was crucified. It was crucified by Pontius Pilate. And here's all the details about him. That would be very weird because now you're claiming that it's this historical thing and that there are all these witnesses of it.
Oh, God.
It just seems like a bit much to get off the ground if you're just putting together this sort of Frankenstein God, right? Because you're taking all these pieces of these other stories of these other gods and combining them into one thing,
he's
and then
right,
trying to make it sound like an actual.
I'll give him this, right? He's absolutely correct that the fact that the story of Jesus's crucifixion and resurrection and whatnot is placed in like a definite historical setting in the first century, and that Jesus is depicted as interacting with people that we can independently establish existed, like high priest Caiaphas, Pontius Pilate, John the Baptist, and stuff like that, means that Jesus almost certainly existed as a historical person, right? Because if you look at other people who have similar claims made about them, like, they ascended to heaven, they now exist as a god, and they are also depicted as living in and around the first century, well, they are also historical, right?
I just want to say one thing about this, though, Camille, that I think, and I think we agree with some of the things he's saying here. The problem is like this same thing can be said about Romulus. The same. I mean, I'm not going to say that we could say Romulus existed, but like putting historical details together here. There are probably real people around that are writing this material, acting like he was eating and he was drinking and he was around here, and real Roman stuff is happening. Historical details can be here that are occurring or that are mentioned. But like you just described Romulus in the great detail and comparing him to Jesus and comparing these events that are being described that we can kind of, in a sense, parallel. And I don't think that category is like something that David Wood would be aware of. I don't think he recognizes that category at all. And seeing how, history or not, legend and these things are there. It's not either or. It's not, it's all made up and it's all myth and it's all bull crap and it's just invented, or it's all historical and it's all true and it all happened and it's all like, you got to accept this. No, I don't think that category fits in his thinking about Jesus. That's all I would like to say. But let's try our best to get to the Michael Jones final point.
Historical figure, and then it's successful. You actually pull it off. You say, hey, we're going to take a bunch of this stuff. I mean, guys, just imagine how difficult this would be if you took a bunch of like Marvel movies or something. You took a little detail about Thor, a little detail about Iron Man. You combined it into some guy. You say, and that was my neighbor. I mean, I don't know. Good luck trying to get that off the ground. Anyway,
the biggest thing is the Jews would never have gone for something like that. They were vehemently anti-pagan in that time period. For them to sort of say that, oh yeah, the God of the Old Testament, the God of Israel, Hashem, Adonai, he's actually like this man who came and did all these things that other pagan deities did. It would have been basically blasphemy.
Yeah, they had.
All right.
Can I quote Justin Martyr again?
Yeah, yeah.
Camille.
When we
No, let
when we
Derek.
say-
Let Derek. Derek's been wanting to get this point out. Let Derek get this point out. Then we'll have you, Camille, get into this Justin Martyr connection because that is a very powerful point. Derek, what were you going to say?
Yeah, just that Jews of that period would have been vehemently against any kind of Hellenization or paganization. I'm sorry, but this is just asinine. We do know that there were zealous, more traditional or Orthodox Jews from the time who did resist the temptation to Hellenize. We have, great evidence for that, but we know that that's just not the case with all Jews from the period. And you're generalizing if you say this. What does it say in Second Maccabees? It laments an increase in Hellenization and the adoption of foreign ways. You've got Philo of Alexandria, who is partaking of the Logos philosophy and speaking of rebirth of a disembodied soul as an immortal being. This is absolutely Greek. It's Hellenistic. You have the Essenes right there in smack dab in Palestine in the Holy Land, who are basically espousing the same thing. This is coming from Greek philosophy and ancient Greek religiosity. You just cannot generalize about anyone from any period of time in history. And to say that no ancient Jews would have done this is absolutely ridiculous. We know better historically.
Camille?
Yeah. So apparently, Justin Martyr, who was not only a second-century Christian, but also from Judea specifically, right? He has a different opinion. Also, do you know who is the single ancient Jewish author that we have the most surviving material from? Like the most amount of text actually surviving from? Can you guess?
First century historian?
No, who is the ancient Jewish author with the with the largest amount of surviving material?
Josephus?
No, it's Philo of Alexandria.
Oh, Philo then. Okay.
Go fifth.
Yeah. So, do you think that Philo might have been a little bit Hellenized? Or no? And mind you, Philo wasn't a pagan, right? Like he would still, he vehemently defended the Hebrew Bible. He vehemently defended all of the commandments, including you should not have another god before me. Tiny bit Hellenized, right? And of course, maybe someone like Michael Jones would say, well, okay, but Philo was living in Alexandria. That was very cosmopolitan. That was mixed Egyptian, Greek influences. So yeah, he was Hellenized. Well, what did Philo of Alexandria believe? He believed that there is a divine being that is the firstborn son of God, who existed before the creation of the universe and was an agent of creation. And he's called the word Logos. Where have I heard that before? So if this is how Hellenized Judaism looks like, then maybe you guys are also in trouble.
Yep.
Yeah.
I love that connection because if you may, for the audience that may not be aware, where is Philo getting his Logos ideas?
That's a good question. So again, it's probably a mix of existing Jewish thought, and then of course like the Greek Hellenistic tradition, Greek philosophical tradition, where the concept of the Logos has like a million different meanings. Like basically every philosopher that uses it, including, for example, Plato, uses it in a different meaning, usually multiple different ways, right? And then the Greek thought is, and the existing Jewish thought is having to do with literally the word that Yahweh spoke when he was creating the universe or shaping the universe into existence.
Mhm.
But then, of course, you anthropomorphize it, right? So you take this concept, which in the Hebrew Bible doesn't have any agency. It's not a person. It doesn't do anything. It's literally like the words that he's speaking out of his mouth. You take it and you start talking about it as if it was a person and as if it was a divine figure. And a similar trajectory happened, for example, with the concept of wisdom. So in the Hebrew Bible, originally, wisdom is just an aspect of God. It's literally God's wisdom, just like we have wisdom, like individual people. And then through poetic language, anthropomorphization, and stuff like that, gradually there emerged an idea that wisdom exists as a being, as a person, independently from Yahweh or semi-independently. And then again, through Greek thought, you start talking about it as like a hypostasis of Yahweh, which is a Greek word, right? So you already have that influence there. Yeah. And by the way, just a really interesting point that I haven't heard anyone else brought up when it comes to how Hellenized the Jews were in the first century. We actually have a lexicon of Greek name of Jewish names in antiquity. So there is a German Jewish scholar named Tal Ilan, and over the last 30 years, she actually collected all of the Jews from the ancient world that we know of. And it's a database of about 50,000. There's about 50,000 males. So we know of about 50,000 individual Jews in the ancient world. And it's actually really interesting to go through it, because did you know that there were Jews in the ancient world that were, for example, named Apollodoros, which means a gift from Apollo? There were Jews, and she took the care to make sure that every single person that's included actually was Jewish. So there was like a Jewish, some kind of Jewish indicator that justifies identifying this person as Jewish. And like a lot of the people on the list specifically have pagan theophoric names. So they have names that contain names of
Theophilus.
pagan deities.
Yeah.
There were Jews who were called Dionysus or
Yep.
Dionysios, right? There were Jews who were called Isidoros, which is a gift from Isis. There were Jews named Demetrios, which is, of course, derived from Demeter, the Greek goddess of agriculture and motherhood and stuff like that. And it's not like individual cases. In some of these Greek theophoric names, several dozens of instances are recorded and attested, which is relatively a lot, given how many different names there were, given that even among Greeks themselves, not everyone had a theophoric name, of course. So, that might be some indication as to how Hellenized these these Jews were. And of course, you might think maybe this wasn't a big deal, right? But in the ancient world, that actually was kind of a big deal. Like, people generally paid much more attention to what kind of names they give to their children. I would, for example, point to the Gospel of Luke, where John the Baptist is originally supposed to be named Zechariah after his father, but an angel actually appears to him and instructs him to name the child John. That's like one attestation to how important, how much emphasis people placed on how their children are going to be named in the ancient world. So, given that this was fairly big deal, I find it absolutely amazing that there were people in the Jews in the ancient world who were named after Heracles, for example. Yeah, it's a crazy world that we live in.
Derek, I pulled that video up with Paula Fredrickson early on. And then I thought of another one. Like, she kills it, right? And this is actually in the vein of what we are talking about. Are we done with the David Wood? And okay, cool. Let me take the time real quick just to get a expert New Testament scholar, right? Paula Fredrickson. This one is public. So you can actually see this online for those who didn't see it. These are her words, right? I ask about God-fearers, the first pagan Christians entering the family of God. In another episode, she actually takes us and says these categories are not the best to try and define, but non-Jews that are entering into this Christ movement.
Those are erected. They do this in the prosuche, in the prayer house, which is the synagogue. Synagogue inscription, releasing my slave, in the name of God, the Almighty, the Blessed, the Jewish benediction, manumitting the slave, calling as witnesses sky, earth, and sun, Zeuskai and Helios. And those are pagan gods dropping into the Jewish synagogues. So there's a lot of Mediterranean mix.
You need to watch that whole episode on the God-fearers because it's exactly what Camille and Derreck have been saying. And it's like, okay, hold up. Like they're literally calling the names of the other gods in manumitting, letting these slaves become free people. And so that was one thing I wanted to point out. And then there was another one I wanted to share just in vain of this before we hit the super chats and then wrap things up is this category, right? I asked her about scholarship.
So it's really impressive to look.
I sped it up. Let me slow it down just a little so I don't sound like a chipmunk. Let's go to 1.5.
Earn this. Where do you see, in light of this question, where do you see scholarship?
Is my quality down on this? Oh no, it's up. Okay.
Heading.
Where's scholarship?
We're going to get better at this, I suspect.
I don't know, because scholarship is like anything else. It's fractured. There are people who belong to this wing of scholarship, and there are people who think they're doing history and they're really doing theology and historical camouflage. And then there are people who are more at home in pagan documentation and then fitting Christian or Jewish materials into that. The study of rabbinics is its own subcontinent. So it's not like if you said scholarship is going, I mean, it's hurting cats.
Yeah.
Wow. So, and one thing between, us here and those watching, she did not want to really deal with like going too deep into N.T. Wright. She can't disagree with him more on so many things, but she was saying in that. And when I stopped the video, it was like, yeah, there's a lot of apologists that are working in the field that are saying they're doing all this historical work, but really they're like axe grinding for their conclusions. And, this was something that me and her were talking about. And she's like, I just don't want to, it'll ruin my day to sit here and get all negative and just sit here and like go at these people. I've written a critical review of his book about, I think it was the resurrection or Paul, something to do with Paul, but she's couldn't disagree with him more on Paul. We lost Derreck again, but let's get these super chats and then we'll wrap things up because you guys, it's been a long live stream and I'd love to have a conversation with both David Wood and specifically Michael Jones has his head wrapped around this material a little better, you can tell, than David Wood does. But I wouldn't mind having like a conversation with you guys and them. Grays 174 says, do we know the interpretive trajectory of Isaiah 53 since its writing, and at what point in history people realized it was supposed to be about Messiah?
That's a good question. So there have been attempts to argue that it was considered that there is evidence that it was considered messianic before the New Testament. I'm not that sure about that. I would have to read up on it. There is a Targum that's roughly contemporary with early Christianity that specifically depicts Isaiah 53 as being messianic. But the problem is that it completely rewrites it. So the suffering servant is no longer a suffering or a servant. He's just a victorious conqueror. So it is about the Messiah, but everything else about it changes. And it's just how these like commentaries or paraphrases of the Hebrew Bible very often go. That being said, I almost don't think it matters whether by the first, like before Christians, before the first century, there were people who were already interpreting it messianically, because when you get to the first century, like any part of the Hebrew Bible could be interpreted messianically. Like everything was open for that kind of interpretation, right? So again, it's not if Christians were first, it's not surprising that they were first, and if they didn't do it, someone else would do it at some point.
Mm-hmm. And this is an interesting point because I had what's the Jewish scholar rabbi AJ Levine on, and AJ Levine actually in her book, what is her book called? Anyway, it's an ecumenical discussion between Jewish interpretation and Christian interpretation and trying to find common ground. And she says in her book that there are Jews, while I've had Rabbi Tovia Singer on, and he was like, this is about Israel, and this is the interpretation, because Jews typically interpret it as Israel here, as the Messiah, or as the the suffering servant. But there are Jewish writings that are non-Christian that actually make it about an individual. I don't know if this is later, but it's within Jewish non-Christian sources. And she says there have been Jews who've interpreted this as an individual. There have been Jews who understand it, and most Jews would take it as the nation, a nationalistic approach. But she said it isn't an exclusive Jewish thing or Christian thing. So keeping that in mind. Great question. Yeah. I know that Jason Staples wrote on this.
The highlight, given that we have a literal expert in the chat, Kip Davis says it would be odd that the Qumran Essenes did not jump on Isaiah 53 in their own writings if it was widely considered messianic. Yeah, that's a pretty good argument from silence, right? And I'm not being facetious. That has evidential weight, definitely.
I think the one guy to go to, according to, because I know Richard Carrier talks about this, he says Jason Staples. So if you're interested in looking into a scholar who takes that approach, Jason Staples has something on this. David Gagnon, again, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your last name. Thank you so much for that super chat. Can you refer me to the prophecy connecting Messiah to Nazareth?
Yeah, it's in the infants narrative of the Gospel of Matthew, right? Matthew says that Jesus coming from the Messiah, from Nazareth, is a fulfillment of prophecy. The problem is that we don't have that prophecy in the Hebrew Bible, and there is a complicated debate that's been going on for 200 years about what to do with that, and there are various different solutions. There is one other thing that you could point to, because there is a prophecy, and I think it's from Isaiah, that could be interpreted messianically, and it's talking about a ruler coming from northern Palestine, essentially, from the area of where one of the regions is Galilee. It's referring to the Galilee of nations. I don't know exactly which chapter that is. So again, you can say that that's why Christians depicted Jesus as coming from Nazareth,
right?
Whether he actually was from Nazareth or not, and whether he existed or not. That's one potentially independent reason for thinking that him being from Nazareth, or being depicted as being from Nazareth, but simultaneously being born in Bethlehem, is not a silver bullet for Jesus's historicity.
Thank you. Grays 174. What is each of your favorite part of the Bible? I'm going to just go with Jonah. I think it's a fun 4-chapter book. It doesn't take long, and it's loaded with stuff. I mean, funny. It's funny too.
That's a good question. Well, I mean, as an atheist, I have to say Ecclesiastes, right? Because that speaks to my rotten soul.
What about you, Derek?
I've never read it, so I couldn't possibly tell you.
What
you got
is
me?
Is there a funny is there somewhere that you like more than others?
No, I think I'm with Camille on Ecclesiastes. I also kind of like Paul's sort of sentimental notion of faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. When he's being poetic, it actually does sound pretty good. It is good nourishment for the soul. I like what Robert Price once said, that it's not like the Bible is the Necronomicon, and too many atheists treat it that way. There's a lot of good stuff in there too, and particularly in the wisdom literature. If we treat it as a repository of ancient wisdom, there is much of value in the Bible, and you don't have to take it to be the divine word of God in order to appreciate that.
Well put. I like it. I'm with you. I think if we handled this for what it is and not got caught up with how the monopolizing of it from Apologist, kind of paint these things, then maybe we can change the attitude towards the literature a little and just see it for what it is. Dalai Lama, thank you for the super chat. If you grow that fabulous beard out, would you wear some silver Viking beads if I sent them to you? I probably would. I'm not gonna lie, man. I've worn freaking like straight up desert outfit from the Middle East. You know, why not? Why not, Dalai Lama? Message me. You're on the Patreon, so please feel free to. I'd be happy. Grays174, do we know if Paul ever made it to Spain?
I don't think we do. There is the letter of that's called like First Clement, right? And that's one of the, I think, the earliest primary source that talks about Peter and Paul dying, and it's super ambiguous. But there have been scholars who suggested that the specific verb that is being used is often used for some kind of internal struggle. So it could be the case that it's saying that Peter and Paul died because of something that went down inside, like in the church, in the community, not because the Romans arrested them and executed them or something like that. But unfortunately, that's lost to history. And I don't even know when the letter was written, to be honest, because like it being attributed to Clement of Rome and being dated to like early first century is not like super rock solid.
All right. Thank you, Grays, for that super chat. I really appreciate it. Jamie Waldron with the super sticker. Good to see you here, Jamie, with the looks like the Legend of Zelda image, which I love Zelda. So you're a fan of one of my favorite games ever. I really appreciate all of you in the chat. If you're still in here, congrats. You will make it to heaven one day, because I can't believe you stuck around this long. But also to go subscribe to Atheologica. I had the YouTube channel pinned at the top of the chat. If you haven't already, please go do that. And then also, I just commented it. Also, Cam and Cam with their YouTube channel. Here is the link to that in the chat. Cam, Camille, if you could do me a favor after and drop a comment. Derek, drop a comment. Let's let people be able to find you in case they're just not sure how, but they can find your comment and then they can go subscribe to your YouTube channels. You guys are doing wonderful work over there, talking about this material and in different things that I don't talk about even here on MythVision. But I hope people will support our guests for all the knowledge they dropped today, and then support us. Join the Patreon. We're working hard. You can harass me there as well. I deleted that because we're going to do another one. That was the monumental impact of Egypt that you did, Derek. But consider helping us out and stick around if you do. It's literally as little as $3 a month. You can pay for the whole year up front with 16% off of that. And you're here for 12 months as a Patreon member of MythVision. I have a lot of videos that I'm still editing that need to be dropped early on there. And I really do appreciate everybody who supports us. So there's my plug. I'd like to allow you guys any final words, any last words that we can get from you.
I hope this isn't going to spiral out of control of like replies to replies to replies.
Well, that's why it's better if, I offered like an invitation to just discuss it. There's nothing wrong with having a conversation with disagreement.
Yeah.
Derek, what are your last words?
Last words are I hope this does spiral completely out of control. I just hope it just turns into absolute madness. And you can find my channel on YouTube. It is Atheological. I do have a Patreon.
Yes.
If you could please support me, if my work has been beneficial to you, I would hugely appreciate it. And follow me on social media. On Facebook, my first name is Derreck. Derreck, last name Bennett, Bennett. I'm a fun kid. I'm a fun guy, like a fun guy. I get it. So follow me on social media as well. It'll be a blasty blast, like a
Yeah.
blast to the face.
Derreck is funny. He's got a lot of posts out there. Go check him out if you're on Facebook or any of the other social media platforms. Subscribe to his channel. And yes, I second supporting him on Patreon. He's trying to do this more. He has a lot of insight, has dug into this stuff for a while. And I'd like to see more of him appear. But he also works. And he's trying to find a way to do that little transition from the earthly realm to the heavenly one, where he can actually be treated as a god. At this point, he's down at the bottom getting stepped on and all this stuff. Anyway, love you guys. I really do appreciate you giving us your time, Camille and Derreck. And I hope to hear a response that we can talk about our differences and agreements, and with the horse's mouth, not just a response video. I'll take either one, but I'm saying I'd rather create like where we can find agreement and why we find disagreement, and get to the actual nitty gritty of why we disagree at the end of the day. So I imagine we're going to disagree, but thank you so much. Hit the like button, share this out, go join Derreck Bennett's, stuff.
It's my Bennett.
Your Bennett will benefit you. And then Camille Gregor, go check him out. Blown away today. Never forget, we are MythVision.